Hello friends, welcome back to another gentle journey through history. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin, get comfortable, maybe adjust your pillow, take a slow breath, and let yourself settle in. Tonight we're going to step inside a world that most people never got to see, even in the Middle Ages themselves. We're heading into the beating heart of a medieval castle, into the one place where fire never slept, where stone walls absorbed the heat of 1,000 meals, and where an army of workers toiled in near complete invisibility to feed everyone from lords to ladies, from knights to scullery boys. Imagine standing inside a fireplace so massive you could walk around in it. Picture yourself surrounded by walls thick enough to survive a siege, with flames roaring at your back and the weight of feeding 50, sometimes hundreds of people resting on your shoulders every single day. This is the castle kitchen of the 14th century, and I promise you it was nothing like the cozy cooking spaces we imagine today. This was an industrial operation, a carefully orchestrated symphony of firestone and human effort that would put most modern restaurants to shame. Can you picture the heat radiating off those stones, the smell of roasting meat mingling with fresh-baked bread, the constant motion of servants moving between shadows and flame? Let's step inside together. The first thing that strikes you when you approach a medieval castle kitchen is not what you'd expect. It's not the smell, though, that comes soon enough. It's not even the heat, though you'll feel that the moment you cross the threshold. No, the first thing that hits you is the architecture itself, and it tells you a story before a single person speaks. These kitchens were built like fortresses within fortresses, and there was a very good reason for that fire. In the 14th century, fire was both your greatest ally and your most terrifying enemy. You needed it for absolutely everything. Cooking, heating, light, all of it required flame. But fire had a nasty habit of escaping, of spreading, of consuming everything in its path. Imagine being a castle architect in 1300, tasked with creating a space where massive fires burned all day, every day, in a building made almost entirely of wood and stone. One spark in the wrong place, and you could lose the entire residence. That's why castle kitchens were often built as separate structures, entirely physically disconnected from the lord's living quarters. Where they did attach to the main castle, thick stone walls, sometimes several feet deep, separated the kitchen from everything else. Let me give you a real example that perfectly captures the scale we're talking about. In the second half of the 14th century, John of Gaunt, one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in England, built a kitchen at Kenilworth Castle that still stands today. The English Heritage Guidebook describes it as 66 feet by 28 feet. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of a modern 3-bedroom house, but it's all one massive room dedicated entirely to cooking. And here's the detail that always amazes me. The main fireplace along one wall measured 78 feet long. 78 feet. That's not a fireplace. That's a firewall. You could literally stand up inside it, walk around, arrange your cooking pots, tend your spits, and still have room to spare. I've seen photographs of Kenilworth's kitchen, and even with school children standing in the space for scale, it's hard to truly convey just how enormous it is. The ceiling soars above you. 3 separate fireplaces march along one wall like the open mouths of dragons. Down the centre of the room there's brickwork that served as a drain for kitchen waste, a remarkable piece of engineering for its time. This wasn't just a place to cook dinner. This was a factory, a production facility designed to feed John of Gaunt's massive household, which could number in the hundreds on any given day. But here's what I find fascinating. Not every castle kitchen was this grand. The scale varied wildly depending on the wealth and status of the lord. Take Portchester Castle, for instance, where King Richard II ordered improvements to the palace lodgings in the late 1400s. The kitchen there is, and I'm being generous here, Pokey. It's small, cramped, almost awkward in its dimensions. Historians believe it had a central fireplace, which by 14th century standards was actually quite old-fashioned. Most elite households had moved on to large chimneyed hearths set into outer walls, which drew smoke more efficiently and provided better heat control. The interesting thing about Portchester's kitchen is that there's no record of Richard ever actually visiting the castle. Some historians think the improvements might have been for Roger Walden, the king's treasurer and future Archbishop of Canterbury, who served as keeper of the castle. Imagine that a royal kitchen built for someone who wasn't even royalty, yet still considered important enough to warrant palace-level accommodations. It tells you something about the complexity of medieval social hierarchies, doesn't it? The space you cooked in reflected not just your practical needs, but your status, your importance, your place in the grand scheme of things. Now let's talk about the architectural innovations that made these kitchens actually functional, because medieval builders were far more clever than we often give them credit for. By the late 14th century, some of the better designed kitchens were incorporating features that would seem luxurious even by later standards. Tiled floors, for instance. A really good castle kitchen would have tiles laid carefully across the entire floor surface. But it wasn't just about appearances. Beneath those tiles, builders installed drainage pipes, actual plumbing, that carried away whatever splashed or spilled during the chaos of cooking. After a heavy session of preparing a feast, servants could wash down the entire floor, and the water would drain away through these pipes built into the earth itself. Think about what that represents for a moment. This is the 1300s. Most people were still throwing their waste into the streets. Chamber pots were emptied out windows. Sanitation was, let's be honest, not exactly a priority for the average person. But in these castle kitchens, someone had the foresight, the engineering knowledge, and the resources to build an actual drainage system. That's not just practical. That's a statement about cleanliness, about order, about maintaining standards even in the hottest, messiest, most chaotic workspace in the entire castle. Ventilation was another critical design element, and you can see medieval architects wrestling with this problem in real time as the 14th century progressed. Early kitchens often had no windows at all. Remember, this is ground level, and windows meant vulnerability. But smoke has to go somewhere, right? So you'd have these tall chimneys, sometimes soaring 30 or 40 feet above the kitchen itself, designed to draw smoke upward and away. The draft had to be perfect. Too little, and smoke filled the kitchen, making it nearly impossible to work. Too much, and your fires burned too hot too fast, consuming precious firewood at an alarming rate. Late in the century, something interesting started happening. Castle designers began putting glazed windows into ground floor rooms, including kitchens. Glass windows. In a kitchen. This was revolutionary. If the kitchen happened to be an attached outbuilding without rooms directly over it, it might even have a skylight. Imagine the difference that natural light made. Cooks spent so much time working in the hours before dawn, and after dusk relying on oil lamps hanging from hooks and candles set in stable places around the workspace. But during the day, actual sunlight streaming through glass windows, that was luxury. That was innovation. And speaking of innovation, let me tell you about something that might surprise you: water engineering. We tend to think of monasteries as the pioneers of plumbing and water management in medieval Europe. And that's largely true. Monks needed fresh water for their daily rituals, for their hospitals, for their brewing operations. They became experts at capturing spring water, directing it through lead or wooden pipes, storing it in cisterns and distributing it where needed. But by the 14th century, castle designers were absolutely borrowing these ideas. A really advanced castle kitchen might have pipes leading water down from a stored source, meaning cooks didn't have to send servants running to the well every time they needed to fill a pot. They could access water directly in the kitchen. Do you see what's happening here? We're looking at the birth of the professional kitchen as a purpose-built space. Before this, cooking happened on an open hearth in the middle of the main living area. Everyone gathered around it for warmth, for light, for the social connection of shared meals. But as castles grew larger, as households expanded, as the logistics of feeding everyone became more complex, the kitchen had to evolve. It had to separate, to specialize, to become its own world. There's something almost poetic about the way these kitchens were hidden from view. Most castle residents, even nobles who lived there year-round, never set foot in the kitchen. It wasn't their space. It wasn't meant for them. The kitchen existed in a kind of parallel dimension, connected to the great hall above through narrow service staircases and hidden passages that kept servants invisible as they carried platters of food from one realm to another. The lord and lady would see the finished feast appear on their table, as if by magic, never witnessing the sweating faces, the burning hands, the organized chaos that made it all possible. I think there's something we can learn from that separation, actually. Not the social hierarchy part. We've thankfully moved beyond the idea that some people are inherently more valuable than others, but the understanding that great work often happens behind the scenes, in spaces we don't think about, performed by people we never see. Every meal that appeared in that great hall represented hours of labour, careful planning, specialised knowledge and physical endurance. The nobles might have thought the feast was about them, about displaying their wealth and power. But really it was about the skill of the cook who balanced flavours, the strength of the scullion, who hauled water from the well, the precision of the baker, who knew exactly when the bread had risen enough. These stone kitchens, with their massive fireplaces and clever drainage systems, were monuments to human ingenuity, to the simple truth that feeding people well requires thought, care, and serious engineering. The next time you turn on your kitchen faucet or adjust your oven temperature with the twist of a dial, remember that someone somewhere 700 years ago was solving the same problems you face. They just had to do it with stone fire and an intimate understanding of how heat and smoke and water behave. As we move forward in our journey tonight, I want you to keep this image in your mind, those thick stone walls built to contain both fire and the secrets of daily labour. Because understanding the architecture, the physical space itself, helps us understand everything else that happened within it. The rhythm of work, the hierarchy of people, the techniques and tools they used, all of it, was shaped by these walls, these fireplaces, these carefully engineered spaces. In our next part, we're going to step inside those walls and spend a full day in the medieval kitchen, from the moment the first scullion wakes in the dark hours before dawn, to light the fires all the way through to the last embers glowing as everyone finally stumbles towards sleep. You'll discover that the castle kitchen never truly rested, and the people who worked there lived by a rhythm as old as fire itself. Picture this. It's 4 o'clock in the morning and the castle is still wrapped in darkness. Most everyone is asleep, tucked under wool blankets, breathing the cold air of a medieval winter night. But down in the kitchen quarters, in a small chamber near the massive stone cooking space we just explored, someone is stirring. Not because they want to, not because dawn is breaking, but because if they don't get up right now in this very moment, there will be no hot food for anyone today. No breakfast for the Lord, no bread for the household, no fire to start the endless cycle of cooking that keeps this entire castle alive. That someone is the scullion, the lowest person in the kitchen hierarchy. Often a boy, sometimes as young as 10 or 11 years old, whose job is to be first awake and last asleep. And let me tell you, being a scullion was not romantic. It wasn't like those charming medieval paintings where everyone looks clean and well-fed. This was brutal, exhausting work that most people today couldn't imagine sustaining for a single week, let alone years. So our scullion, let's call him Thomas, stumbles out of his sleeping space. He doesn't have a bed, not really. More like a straw pallet on the floor in a room he shares with other kitchen servants. The air is cold enough that he can see his breath. His hands are already chapped from yesterday's work, cracked and raw, from constant exposure to water, lye, soap and heat. He pulls on the same clothes he wore yesterday because, well, he only has one set, maybe two if he's lucky. And he heads toward the kitchen in near total darkness, feeling his way along stone walls he knows by touch. His first job before anything else can happen is to get the fires going. Every single one of them. Remember those massive fireplaces we talked about? They need to be roaring by the time the cooks arrive, which means Thomas has maybe an hour, maybe less, to coax life back into yesterday's embers. He starts with the banking, the technique of covering coals with the ash at night to keep them alive until morning. Carefully, so carefully, he brushes away the ash, finds the red glow beneath, adds kindling blows gently until smoke appears, then flame. One fire, then another, then another. His face gets covered in soot. His eyes water from smoke. His back aches from bending over hearth after hearth. But he can't stop because if even one fire goes out completely, if he has to start from scratch with flint and steel, he'll fall behind. And falling behind in a medieval kitchen meant punishment. Maybe a beating. Maybe losing his position entirely, which meant losing food, shelter, everything. There's something I want you to understand about this daily rhythm because it reveals so much about medieval life that we often miss. We think of the Middle Ages as this slow pastoral time when people lived by the sun and had endless hours for rest. But inside these castle kitchens the pace was relentless, industrial even. Because once the fires were lit, the clock was ticking. By 5 a.m, other servants start appearing. The undercooks arrive, rubbing sleep from their eyes, checking what Thomas has accomplished. They start hauling water from the well trip after trip, because you'd be amazed how much water a kitchen uses. Washing vegetables, filling cauldrons, cleaning yesterday's pots, which have been soaking overnight in cold water, because there was no time to scrub them before everyone collapsed. Making bread dough, which requires precise amounts of liquid to get the consistency right. Do you ever think about water when you cook? Probably not, right? You turn on the tap and there it is, hot water, cold water, whatever you need. But imagine having to fetch every single drop from a well that might be 50 yards away, hauling it in heavy wooden buckets, making sure you don't spill, because spilled water means another trip. Imagine doing this before the sun rises when your fingers are numb and you're already exhausted from lighting fires. By 6 o'clock, the head cook appears. Now the head cook is a different creature entirely. He doesn't light fires or haul water. Those tasks are beneath his station. He's here to plan, to supervise, to taste, to make sure everything runs smoothly. In a large castle, the head cook might hold a position of genuine authority, equivalent to a minor nobleman. He could be paid handsomely given his own private room, respected by everyone because of his specialized knowledge. A truly skilled head cook was worth his weight in silver, maybe even gold, because he could make or break the Lord's reputation. Think about it from the Lord's perspective. You're hosting important guests, maybe other nobles, maybe clergy, maybe someone from the royal court. The quality of the meal you serve sends a message about your wealth, your taste, your power. A mediocre cook serves bland food, and suddenly people are whispering that you're losing your touch, that your estates aren't as profitable as they used to be, that maybe you're not as important as you claim. But a brilliant cook, Cook who can transform basic ingredients into something memorable. That cook makes you look like a genius, like someone who deserves respect and attention. So the head cook arrives and he immediately starts directing traffic. He checks the fires, making sure they are at the right temperature for different tasks. Bread baking needs consistent moderate heat. Roasting meat requires intense sustained fire. Simmering soups and stews need gentle warmth that can be maintained for hours. He assigns tasks. You work on the bread, you start preparing vegetables. You check the stores to see what meat we have available. Between 6 and 8 in the morning, the kitchen transforms into something like organized chaos. There's a rhythm to it, a pattern that everyone knows. The baker is kneading dough, massive amounts of it, because bread is the foundation of every meal in medieval life. Rich or poor, high-born or low, everyone eats bread. The difference is in the quality: fine white bread made from wheat for the nobles, coarser dark bread made from barley or rye for the servants. But everyone gets bread. Breakfast itself is usually a light affair, at least by medieval standards. Maybe some bread with cheese or cold meat left over from yesterday. Maybe ale, which people drank at breakfast because it was safer than water, the brewing process having killed most harmful bacteria. But even this simple meal requires coordination. The butler, who's responsible for beverages and serving, needs to make sure the right ale gets to the right people. The pantler in charge of the pantry and bread distribution needs to slice fresh loaves and arrange them properly. Here's a detail that always strikes me. Most castle residents ate together in the great hall, but there was a strict order to who got served first. The lord and his immediate family, obviously, then high-ranking guests, then knights and clergy, then household officials, then ordinary servants. The kitchen had to stage everything perfectly so that food appeared at the right temperature for the right people at the right time. This wasn't just cooking. This was logistics. By 8 o'clock, breakfast is finished, and now the real work begins: preparing dinner, the main meal of the day, which would be served around 11 o'clock or noon. In a moderately sized castle feeding 50 people, this meant the kitchen staff had about 3 hours to prepare multiple courses of food. 3 hours sounds like plenty of time until you remember that everything takes 10 times longer without modern equipment. Want to chop onions? Great. But your knife needs sharpening first, and sharpening takes time. Want to roast a chicken? Wonderful, but first someone needs to pluck it, gut it, prepare it for the spit, then monitor it constantly while it cooks, because there's no timer, no temperature gauge, just experience and instinct. Want to make a sauce? Perfect, but that means grinding spices by hand, mixing ingredients in exact proportions, heating it carefully over a fire whose temperature you control by moving the pot closer or farther from the flames. Let me give you a specific example from the historical record. We have a cookbook from 1420 called Du Fait de Cuisine, written by Mestre Chicard, who was the master chef for Duke Amadeus VIII of Savoy. Chicard was writing instructions for how to prepare a 2-day banquet, and even though he's talking about a much larger scale than daily cooking, his details are revealing. He recommends having at hand at least 1,000 cartloads of good dry firewood and a large barn full of coal. 1,000 cartloads for 2 days of cooking. Now, obviously, a normal day wouldn't require anything close to that amount, but it gives you a sense of proportion, doesn't it? Fire consumed resources at an astonishing rate. Someone had to chop that wood, someone had to transport it, someone had to store it, someone had to monitor how much was being used so they didn't run out at a critical moment. These are jobs we never think about because we've automated them, but in the 14th century this was someone's entire existence. As the morning progresses toward noon, the kitchen reaches peak intensity. Multiple things are cooking simultaneously. Meat is roasting on spits turned by hand, usually by young boys whose arms must have felt like they were going to fall off. Stews are simmering in cauldrons. Bread is baking in the ovens, filling the air with that incredible smell of fresh yeast and heat. Vegetables are being cleaned, chopped, prepared for various dishes, and everyone is sweating. I mean truly sweating, not just a little perspiration, but rivers of it. Because remember, this is a room dominated by open fires, and it's enclosed by thick stone walls that absorb and radiate heat. In summer, it must have been almost unbearable. Even in winter, when the cold outside was biting, the kitchen was probably the warmest place in the entire castle. Servants who worked elsewhere would sometimes sneak down just to thaw their frozen fingers near the hearth. The head cook moves between stations, tasting everything. This was crucial because there were no written recipes in the way we think of them today. Oh, there were cookbooks, sure, but they were more like memory aids for people who already knew how to cook. Instructions were vague: add spices to taste, cook until done, season as needed. A skilled cook had to know by instinct when something was ready, when it needed more salt, when the meat was perfectly tender. Around 11 o'clock or noon, dinner is served. Platters start making their way up those narrow service staircases we talked about, carried by servants who've practiced this journey so many times they could do it blindfolded. The goal is to get food from kitchen to table while it's still hot, which isn't easy when you're navigating stone corridors and stairs. This is where the architecture of those hidden passages really mattered. The shorter the distance, the better the food quality. But here's the thing, the kitchen doesn't get to rest just because dinner is being served. While some servants are carrying food upstairs, others are already starting to clean up the morning's mess. Those pots and pans we talked about, they're not going to scrub themselves. And medieval cooking pots, especially the cauldrons used for stews, could be absolutely massive. Cleaning them meant hauling them to the scullery area, filling them with water, using sand and lye soap to scour away burned-on food, then rinsing and drying everything. Thomas our scullion probably spent half his day scrubbing. His hands would be raw from the lye, which was a harsh alkaline soap made from wood ash. Sometimes his skin would crack and bleed. There was no such thing as rubber gloves or hand lotion. You just endured. Between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, there's a strange sort of quiet in the kitchen. The main meal is done. Supper won't be served until evening, and it's typically lighter than dinner, maybe just bread and cheese with some ale or leftovers from the noon meal. This is the time for maintenance, for planning, for catching your breath. The head cook might take inventory of the stores, figuring out what needs to be ordered for tomorrow. Servants might finally get a chance to sit down to eat their own meal, to rest their aching feet. But the fires never go out completely. There's always something simmering, something baking, something that needs attention. Medieval people understood that letting a fire die meant hours of work to restart it, so they kept coals alive, banking them carefully, maintaining that precious heat source that made everything else possible. And then as evening approaches, there's a second surge of activity for supper. It's not as intense as the dinner preparation, but it still requires coordination. Fresh bread might need to be baked, cheese needs to be sliced, ale needs to be poured. The same service routine happens again, food goes from kitchen to hall, dishes come back dirty, everything gets cleaned. Finally, usually around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, things start to wind down. The last embers are banked for the morning. The last pots are scrubbed and stacked. Servants stumble toward their sleeping quarters exhausted. And Thomas our scullion is often the last one to lie down, having started before everyone else, and finished after everyone else. He'll sleep maybe 6 hours if he's lucky, and then it all begins again. There's something deeply human about this rhythm, isn't there? This cycle of fire and food and exhaustion and renewal. These weren't machines. These were people. And they lived by a clock measured in flames and hunger, in the endless need to keep feeding everyone around them. What strikes me most about understanding this daily rhythm is how it completely changes our image of medieval castle life. When we think of castles, we picture knights and banquets and romance. But the truth is, most people in a castle spent their days doing exactly what Thomas did, waking before dawn, working until their bodies ached, keeping the fires burning so that everyone else could eat. They were invisible to the nobles, hidden behind thick walls and narrow staircases, but without them, the whole elegant system would have collapsed. Now that we understand the relentless rhythm of the kitchen day, the question becomes, who exactly were all these people moving through this space? We've met Thomas the scullion and caught glimpses of the head cook, but a castle kitchen was home to an entire hierarchy of workers, each with specific roles, specific skills, specific places in a carefully ordered system. Let's meet the kitchen army, the dozens of people whose names history rarely recorded, but whose labour made everything possible. If you've ever worked in a restaurant, you know there's a pecking order. The head chef runs the kitchen like a general commanding troops. Sous chefs handle specific stations. Line cooks execute the actual cooking. Prep cooks do the groundwork. Dishwashers keep everything clean. Everyone has a role, everyone knows their place, and the whole operation only works when people stay in their lanes. Well, I've got news for you. That entire system, that whole brigade structure that professional kitchens still use today, has its roots in medieval castle kitchens. The hierarchy we're about to explore was so effective, so precisely calibrated to handle the chaos of feeding hundreds of people, that its basic shape survived 7 centuries. But here's what makes the medieval version fascinating. It wasn't just about kitchen efficiency. This hierarchy reflected the entire feudal system in miniature. Your position in the kitchen determined not only what you did, but where you slept, how much you earned, whether you had any hope of advancement, and how people treated you. In a very real sense, the kitchen was a microcosm of medieval society itself, complete with all its rigid structures and occasional opportunities for someone talented to rise above their station. Let's start at the very top with the master cook. And when I say top, I mean it. In a large aristocratic household, the master cook wasn't just another servant. He was a figure of genuine authority, someone who might hold a position equivalent to a minor nobleman. Some master cooks were paid annual salaries that would make your eyes water, the medieval equivalent of what we'd pay a highly skilled professional today. They might have their own private chambers, their own servants, their own impressive wardrobes. Why? Because they possess specialized knowledge that literally could not be replaced. Imagine you're a lord hosting a visit from someone important. Maybe a bishop, maybe a neighboring duke, maybe even someone from the royal court. The meal you serve is a performance, a display of your wealth and sophistication. Your master cook is the director of that performance. He needs to know not just how to make food taste good, that's basic, but how to present it beautifully, how to balance flavors according to medieval medical theory, how to source rare ingredients, how to coordinate timing so that multiple courses appear in perfect sequence. He needs to understand the symbolic meanings of different foods, because certain dishes carried messages about status and occasion. A truly exceptional master cook was a tradable asset. Lords would actually try to poach talented cooks from each other, offering better pay, better conditions, more resources. There are records of cooks moving between great households, building reputations that preceded them. When a famous master cook arrived at a new castle to prepare for a major feast, it was an event in itself. He would inspect the kitchen facilities with a critical eye, assessing whether they met his standards. He'd review the available ingredients, sometimes rejecting items he deemed inferior. He'd begin planning the sequence of preparations that would culminate in the feast, working backward from when food needed to be served to determine when each task had to begin. The master cook had absolute authority over everyone else in the kitchen. His word was law. If he ordered someone to grind spices for 3 straight hours, you ground spices for 3 straight hours. If he tasted a sauce and declared it needed more saffron, someone ran to get more saffron, no questions asked. This wasn't tyranny exactly, though I'm sure some master cooks abused their power. It was necessity. Cooking at scale, especially with primitive equipment and unpredictable fire temperatures, required split-second decisions based on experience. There was no time for committee discussions or democratic voting. Someone had to be in charge, and that someone was the master cook. Working directly under the master cook, you'd find specialized experts, each responsible for a particular domain. The saucier, for instance, was a critical position. Medieval cuisine was absolutely obsessed with sauces. We're not talking about simple gravy here. These were complex preparations involving multiple spices, wines, vinegars, the juice of unripe grapes called verjuice, all ground together and carefully balanced. A skilled saucier could transform ordinary roasted meat into something extraordinary. He'd know which sauces paired with which meats, how to adjust seasonings based on the quality of available ingredients, how to achieve the right consistency through careful heating and stirring. Then there was the slaughterer, a role that sounds grim to modern ears but was absolutely essential. Animals didn't arrive at the kitchen pre-butchered and wrapped in plastic. They arrived alive or freshly killed by hunters, and someone had to transform them into usable cuts of meat. The slaughterer needed to know animal anatomy intimately, where to make cuts to get the best joints, how to separate meat from bone efficiently, how to preserve valuable organs like hearts and livers, how to render fat for cooking. Nothing was wasted, and I mean nothing. Even intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. Even blood was collected and used in puddings. The slaughteurer's expertise meant the difference between using 90% of an animal versus using 95%, and that 5% mattered when you were feeding dozens of people daily. The baker held a position of particular importance because bread was quite literally the staff of life in medieval culture. Everyone ate bread at every meal. It was filler, plate utensil, and staple food all rolled into one. A castle baker might be responsible for producing hundreds of loaves daily, and the quality couldn't vary. The lord's white bread had to be perfect, fine-textured, made from the best wheat flour. The servant's darker bread had to be edible and filling even if it was coarser. The baker controlled fermentation times, oven temperatures, and ingredient ratios with the precision of a chemist. Too much yeast and bread rose too fast, creating uneven texture. Too little and it stayed dense and heavy. Oven too hot and the crust burned before the interior cooked. Too cool and you got pale, doughy loaves that no one wanted to eat. Here's a detail I love. Medieval bakers often had their own marking system, pressing distinctive patterns into loaves before baking, so they could identify their work. This wasn't vanity, it was quality control. If a loaf turned out poorly, the baker could be held accountable. But if every loaf from a particular baker consistently pleased people, his reputation grew. Some bakers became so renowned that their bread was requested specifically. The poulterer managed everything related to birds, chickens, geese, ducks, even exotic game birds like peacocks or swans for special occasions. Keeping poultry fresh was tricky business before refrigeration. Birds had to be plucked, gutted, and prepared quickly. The poulterer knew which birds were best roasted, which made better stews, which could be preserved through salting or smoking. During major feasts, he might oversee the preparation of dozens of birds simultaneously, each requiring slightly different cooking times and techniques. And then there was the fruiterer, responsible for the castle's fruit supply. This role became increasingly important during the 14th century, as nobles developed more sophisticated tastes for preserved fruits, candied fruits, and fruit-based desserts. The fruiterer needed to know when different fruits were in season, how to select the best specimens, and how to preserve them for use throughout the year. Apples could be stored in cool cellars. Berries had to be made into preserves with honey or sugar. Dried fruits like figs and dates, often imported at great expense, had to be kept safe from moisture and pests. Below these specialists you had the undercook's men who'd learned the basics, but hadn't yet achieved mastery or specialization. They were the workhorses of the kitchen, handling whatever task the master cook assigned. Chopping vegetables, stirring cauldrons, checking bread ovens, moving heavy pots. They were skilled enough to be trusted with important work, but not prestigious enough to have their own domains. Many undercooks spent years, sometimes decades, hoping to advance to a specialized position, or even if they were exceptionally talented and lucky to become a master cook themselves. Then came a unique group that always fascinates me, the spit boys. Their job was brutally simple and brutally hard. They turned the roasting spits, that's it. That was their entire existence. But don't underestimate what this involved. A large roasting spit might hold a whole boar, or multiple large joints of beef, or a dozen chickens. The meat could weigh 50 pounds, even more. The spit had to turn constantly, evenly for hours to ensure the meat cooked uniformly without burning, and you couldn't just set it and forget it. Someone had to be there, physically turning the handle, monitoring the fire, basting the meat with drippings to keep it moist. Imagine being 12 years old, standing in front of a roaring fire for 4 or 5 hours, your arms screaming with fatigue, sweat pouring down your face, while more senior cooks occasionally bark instructions at you. Turn it faster. You're letting that side get too close to the flames. Baste it again. There's a reason spit boys were typically young. The work required strength and endurance, but not necessarily skill or judgment. It was a stepping stone, something you did while learning other aspects of cooking, hopefully moving on to better positions as you grew older and more experienced. Some kitchens actually developed mechanical devices to automate spit turning, using weighted systems or even small dogs running on wheels to provide rotational power. But many castles, especially smaller or more traditional ones, still relied on human labour well into the 14th century and beyond. Now let's talk about 3 positions that worked closely with the kitchen, but were technically separate: the butler, the pantler, and the cellarer. These roles were about storage and service rather than cooking, but they were absolutely critical to the smooth functioning of meals. The butler, and yes, this is where our modern word comes from, was in charge of the buttery, which stored beverages. Wine ale meads sometimes imported drinks like Grecian wine or spiced hippocras. The butler's responsibilities were immense. He had to maintain proper storage conditions so wine didn't spoil. He had to know which wines paired with which courses. He had to supervise the serving of drinks in the Great Hall, making sure nobles received fine wine in appropriate vessels while servants got small beer or watered ale. In royal courts, the butler's position carried such prestige that tasting the king's wine before serving it theoretically to check for poison, but mostly as ceremony, became a hereditary honour passed down through noble families. The pantler ran the pantry, which stored bread and other dry goods like grains, flour, dried peas and beans. His job was inventory management before inventory management had a name. How much grain do we have? How much bread can we produce from it? Are we going to run short before the next harvest? Do we need to purchase additional supplies? The pantler kept detailed records, or at least he did if he was literate. Many pantlers came from slightly higher social classes than typical kitchen servants, precisely because the role required organisational skills and sometimes reading and writing ability. The cellarer managed the castle's cellars, those cool underground chambers we mentioned earlier, that stored everything from barrels of salted meat to wheels of aging cheese. Temperature control was the cellarer's obsession. Too warm and cheese spoiled or wine went bad. Too cold and certain vegetables became damaged. The cellarer made regular rounds, checking on stored goods, rotating stock. So older items got used first, identifying anything that was starting to deteriorate so it could be consumed before becoming completely unusable. These three positions, butler, pantler, and cellarer, formed a triumvirate of storage and service that paralleled the cooking hierarchy. They reported to the steward, who was essentially the castle's chief operating officer, but they worked in constant coordination with the master cook. After all, what good was a brilliant menu if the cellarer couldn't provide the preserved meats needed, or the pantler couldn't supply enough flour for bread, or the butler didn't have appropriate wine? And then, at the very bottom of this elaborate hierarchy, we return to where we started, the scullions. These were the truly invisible workers, the ones who made everything possible through sheer grinding labour, scrubbing pots, hauling water, sweeping floors, lighting fires, taking out waste. Their work was backbreaking and endless, and they received minimal pay, minimal respect, minimal acknowledgement. Historical records rarely mention scullions by name. They were interchangeable in the eyes of the nobility, just bodies doing necessary work. But here's what I find remarkable: many successful master cooks started as scullions. The kitchen offered one of the few paths in medieval society for genuine upward mobility, based on talent rather than birth. If you were a scullion but you paid attention, if you learned how flavours combined, if you developed a feel for fire temperatures and cooking times, if you showed initiative and skill, you might get promoted to undercook. From there, if you were exceptional, you might specialise. And from there, if fortune smiled on you, you might eventually become a master cook yourself, commanding respect and earning a comfortable living. It wasn't easy. It wasn't common. Most scullions remained scullions. But the possibility existed, and that possibility mattered. It meant the kitchen operated on a kind of meritocracy that was rare in the rigidly stratified medieval world. Your birth didn't matter nearly as much as your ability. A peasant's son with talent could theoretically achieve a position of genuine authority. That's remarkable when you think about how few other avenues existed for social advancement. There's also something touching about the relationships that must have developed in these kitchens. You're working alongside the same people every single day, often for years. You're sharing the heat, the exhaustion, the occasional triumphs when a dish turns out perfectly. The master cook might be authoritarian during work hours, but after the evening meal, when everyone's sitting around the dying fires eating their own simple supper, I'd like to think there were moments of camaraderie, stories told, jokes shared, advice given from older cooks to younger ones. We see hints of this in the few personal accounts that survive. Instructions passed from master to apprentice weren't just about technique. They included wisdom about life, about patience, about the satisfaction of doing difficult work well. There's a humanity there that transcends the formal hierarchy. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize too much. The hierarchy also meant inequality, sometimes harsh treatment, definitely exhaustion and injury, and shortened lifespans for those at the bottom. But within its constraints, it created order out of potential chaos. It meant everyone knew their role, their responsibilities, their place in the larger machinery. And when the system worked well, when a talented master cook led a well-trained staff, the results could be genuinely impressive. Royal courts and the largest noble households could have kitchen staffs numbering in the hundreds. Hundreds, pantlers, bakers, waferers, sauciers, larderers, butchers, carvers, page boys, milkmaids, butlers, and numerous scullions, all working in coordinated effort to produce 2 major meals daily for several hundred people. The logistics alone are staggering. But the hierarchy made it manageable. Everyone knew who gave orders and who took them. Information flowed up and down clearly. Problems could be identified and solved quickly because responsibility was clearly assigned. So when you think about medieval castle kitchens, don't just picture food and fire. Picture people a complex web of relationships and responsibilities, skills and aspirations, authority and subordination. Picture the master cook tasting a sauce with the concentration of an artist. Picture the spit boy with aching arms dreaming of the day he might give orders instead of taking them. Picture the scullion scrubbing pots his hands raw, but his mind absorbing everything he observes. These weren't just workers. They were individuals navigating a system, finding meaning in their labor-building lives within constraints we can barely imagine. Understanding this hierarchy helps us appreciate what came next, the actual tools and equipment these people used. Because positions and skills only mattered if you had the right implements to transform raw ingredients into finished meals. The medieval kitchen was filled with specialized tools, some familiar, some strange to modern eyes, each designed for specific tasks in an age when everything had to be done by hand, by fire, and by human ingenuity. Walk into a modern kitchen, and you'll find tools that would seem like absolute magic to a medieval cook. Electric mixers that knead dough in seconds. Digital thermometers that tell you the exact internal temperature of meat. Non-stick pans that release food effortlessly. Refrigerators that preserve ingredients for weeks. But here's what would surprise you if you took that medieval cook and showed them the basic categories of tools, mixing bowls, knives, pots, stirring spoons. They'd nod in recognition. The fundamentals haven't changed. What's changed is the technology, the materials, the precision. Medieval cooks were solving the same problems we solve today. They just had to be far more clever about it. Let me tell you about something that might seem mundane but was actually one of the most valuable items in a 14th century kitchen, the pepper mill. Now you probably have one sitting on your counter or dining table right now, and you've never given it a second thought. But in medieval times, a pepper mill was worth more than its weight in silver, sometimes literally. Because pepper itself was extraordinarily expensive, imported from distant lands at tremendous cost, and having the ability to grind it fresh meant you could control exactly how much you used. Pre-ground pepper could be adulterated, mixed with other substances to stretch it further, but whole peppercorns. Those were the real thing, and grinding them yourself was both a practical necessity and a status symbol. The pepper mill itself was a mechanical marvel for its time. Usually made from wood or metal, it used a grinding mechanism that crushed peppercorns between two rough surfaces, releasing their aromatic oils. The cook would turn a handle and freshly ground pepper would fall out below. Simple, right? But think about the engineering involved. The grinding surfaces had to be hard enough to crack peppercorns but designed so they didn't jam. The mechanism had to be robust enough to withstand daily use. And the whole thing had to be cleanable because stuck pepper from yesterday would go rancid and ruin today's seasoning. I mention the pepper mill first because it represents something important about medieval kitchen technology. Innovation happened constantly, driven by necessity and the demands of increasingly sophisticated cuisine. These weren't primitive people making do with crude implements. They were problem solvers, creating specialized tools for specific tasks. Take cauldrons, for instance. When you hear the word cauldron, you probably picture witches stirring bubbling potions, right? Pop culture has done a number on our perception of what were actually incredibly practical cooking vessels. Medieval cauldrons came in a bewildering variety of sizes and shapes, each designed for different purposes. A small cauldron, maybe holding 2 or 3 gallons, might be used for making sauces or cooking vegetables for the Lord's table. A medium one could handle stews or soups for a dozen people. But the truly massive cauldrons, the ones that required 2 strong men to lift even when empty, these could hold 20, 30, even 40 gallons of liquid. They were used to make the basic pottages and soups that fed the entire household. These large cauldrons were usually made of iron beaten and shaped by skilled blacksmiths. Iron was chosen because it could withstand intense heat without cracking, unlike ceramic pots, which might shatter if exposed to direct flame. But iron had its challenges too. It was heavy, obviously. It also required careful maintenance. You couldn't just leave it wet or it would rust. After each use, someone, usually our friend the scullion, had to dry it thoroughly, sometimes even coating it lightly with fat to prevent oxidation. And if rust did develop, it had to be scrubbed away with sand or ash before the cauldron could be used again. Hanging these massive cauldrons over the fire required specialized equipment, pot hooks and chains that could be raised or lowered to control cooking temperature. Remember, there were no knobs to turn, no buttons to push. If your stew was boiling too vigorously, you raised the cauldron farther from the flames. If it needed more heat, you lowered it closer. This required constant attention and good judgment. An experienced cook could tell by the sound of the bubbling, by the steam, rising by the smell, exactly where the cauldron needed to be. Frying pans in the medieval kitchen were things of beauty, honestly. They were beaten from iron, carefully hammered into shape, and then seasoned much like we season cast iron cookware today. The seasoning process involved coating the pan with fat and heating it repeatedly until a natural non-stick surface developed. A well-seasoned medieval frying pan could cook eggs or fish without everything sticking and burning. But achieving that seasoning took time and care, and it could be ruined by using harsh cleaning methods or letting someone scrub it with abrasive materials. There were probably kitchen arguments about proper pan care that would sound very familiar to modern cooks who are passionate about their cast iron. Gridirons, which were essentially metal grates for cooking over direct heat, came in various sizes and configurations. Some were simple flat grids that you could place fish or small cuts of meat on. Others had adjustable heights or even rotating mechanisms. The key was getting food close enough to the fire to develop those delicious charred flavors without burning it to cinders. This was more art than science, requiring someone to monitor constantly rotating food, adjusting position using their senses to determine doneness. Now let's talk about knives, because medieval cooks had entire collections of them, each suited to different tasks. There was no such thing as one good knife that did everything. You needed heavy cleavers for breaking down large joints of meat or chopping through bones. You needed thinner blades for delicate work like filleting fish or trimming fat. You needed small paring knives for detailed tasks like removing the cores from apples or preparing garnishes, and every single one of these knives required regular sharpening. Think about that for a moment. In a modern kitchen, you might sharpen your knives once a month, maybe less if you're lazy about it. But medieval cooks were using their knives hard all day long on tough ingredients, and their knives were made from softer iron that dulled quickly. Someone had to sharpen blades daily using whetstones wetted with water or oil, working the edge carefully to maintain the right angle. This was skilled work. A poorly sharpened knife was not only inefficient but dangerous, more likely to slip and cause injury. Stirring spoons and ladles came in every conceivable size, from small ones for sauces to enormous ladles that could scoop a quart of soup in a single go. Most were made from wood, which didn't conduct heat and was gentle on cookware, but they had to be carved from close-grained wood that wouldn't splinter or crack. Fruit wood like apple or pear was prized because it was hard and durable. A good stirring spoon might last for years if properly cared for, developing a smooth patina from constant use. Skimmers, those flat perforated spoons designed to remove foam and impurities from broths, were essential for creating the clear, refined soups that impressed noble diners. Medieval culinary standards demanded that broths be clarified with all the scum and fat skimmed away to leave a pristine liquid. This was partly aesthetic. Nobles expected their food to look as good as it tasted, but it was also tied to medical theories about digestion. Clear broth was considered easier to digest, more healthful than cloudy, fatty soup. One of my favourite specialised tools is the dressing board, which was specifically for carving meat. It wasn't just a cutting board like we use today. These were substantial pieces of wood, often with channels carved around the edges to catch juices, and sometimes with spikes or holders to steady large roasts while they were being carved. Carving itself was an art form in medieval culture. The way meat was carved and presented mattered enormously. There were even entire treatises written on proper carving technique, which cuts to make how to arrange slices attractively on serving platters. A skilled carver was valued almost as much as the cook. Now here's where things get really interesting, the innovations that emerged during the 14th century itself. This was a period of remarkable culinary advancement, and the tools evolved to match. Tiled floors, which we mentioned before, weren't just about appearance or drainage. They represented a shift in thinking about kitchen hygiene. A dirt floor, which many earlier kitchens had, was impossible to keep truly clean. But tiles could be scrubbed, disinfected with boiling water, maintained to a standard that reduced contamination and improved food safety. Floor drains were genuinely revolutionary. The engineering required to build a drainage pipe into the earth beneath tiled flooring was non-trivial. You needed to understand slope and gravity, how to construct a pipe that wouldn't collapse or clog where to direct the wastewater so it didn't create problems elsewhere. Some castle kitchens borrowed technology from monasteries, which had been the real pioneers in water engineering throughout the medieval period. Monks needed fresh water for their infirmaries, their breweries, their daily rituals, and they developed sophisticated systems of pipes, cisterns and drains. Water access in the kitchen was another major innovation. Earlier generations of cooks sent servants running to wells constantly. But by the late 1400s, some advanced kitchens had water pipes leading directly into the workspace. This might have been gravity-fed from a storage cistern on a higher level, or it might have involved a simple pump mechanism. Either way, having water available without leaving the kitchen saved enormous amounts of time and labour. It meant cooks could rinse vegetables, fill pots, or clean spills immediately, rather than waiting for someone to haul water from outside. Glazed windows, which started appearing in ground floor kitchens during this period, changed the working environment dramatically. Natural light meant less reliance on oil lamps and candles, which were expensive and created their own smoke and heat. Being able to see clearly, to judge the colour of sauces or the doneness of bread by actual daylight rather than flickering lamplight, improved quality control, and for the workers themselves, psychologically having windows must have made those long hours in a hot, smoky space slightly more bearable. Let's talk about ovens, because medieval bread ovens were engineering achievements in their own right. They were typically built from stone or brick, carefully constructed with domed interiors that distributed heat evenly. The principle was simple but effective. You built a fire directly inside the oven, let it burn until the stone walls absorbed tremendous heat, then raked out the embers and put your bread directly on the hot floor. The retained heat in the walls would bake the bread through radiant warmth rather than direct flame. But simple in principle doesn't mean simple in practice. Getting the temperature right was entirely a matter of experience. The baker might test it by throwing a handful of flour into the oven and watching how quickly it browned, or by sticking his hand in briefly, which sounds insane but was apparently standard practice, and judging the heat by feel. Too hot and bread crusts burned while the inside stayed doughy. Too cool and you got pale, dense loaves that didn't rise properly. The oven had to maintain consistent heat for long enough to bake however many loaves needed making, which in a large household could be dozens. Some ovens were absolutely enormous. King John of England commissioned ovens at Marlborough and Ludgershall castles that were large enough to accommodate whole oxen. Whole oxen? Imagine the engineering challenges of an oven that size. The structural support needed to prevent the dome from collapsing. The amount of fuel required to heat that much stone. The coordination needed to actually maneuver a massive carcass into and out of the oven safely. These weren't just cooking implements. They were architectural features, permanent installations that defined what was possible in the kitchen. Smaller tools might seem less impressive but were equally important. Graters for reducing hard cheese or stale bread to crumbs. Mortars and pestles for grinding spices, which was done fresh for each dish, because ground spices lost their potency quickly. Sieves and strainers made from cloth or woven metal for clarifying liquids or creating smooth purees. Measuring vessels calibrated to standard volumes so recipes could be reproduced consistently. And here's something that really drives home how sophisticated these kitchens were. Medieval cooks understood the importance of tool maintenance and organization. Knives were hung on racks, not tossed in drawers, where blades could dull or people could get cut. Iron pots were stacked carefully to prevent damage. Wooden implements were stored where air could circulate to prevent rot. The scullery area where everything was washed has designated spaces for different types of equipment. This wasn't just tidiness for its own sake. It was workflow optimization. If you knew exactly where every tool was, if everything had its proper place, you could work faster and more efficiently. There's a wonderful continuity between these medieval kitchens and professional kitchens today. Walk into any high-end restaurant kitchen and you'll see the same principles at work, specialized tools for specific tasks, careful organization, regular maintenance, constant attention to cleanliness and efficiency. The head chef running a modern kitchen is in many ways descended from that medieval master cook commanding a complex operation where timing and coordination are everything. But I think what moves me most about these tools is how they represent human adaptation. Medieval cooks couldn't control fire with a thermostat. They couldn't preserve food with refrigeration. They couldn't measure temperature with a thermometer. So they developed tools and techniques that worked within their constraints. The adjustable pot hook that let them raise or lower cauldrons. The seasoned frying pan that created a non-stick surface naturally. The bread oven that stored heat in stone walls. Every tool was a small victory over the limitations of their world, a way of bending nature to human needs. When we use our modern tools, the ones powered by electricity and precision manufacturing, we're standing on the shoulders of countless medieval cooks who figured out the basics. They learned that heavy pots distribute heat more evenly than thin ones, that sharp knives are safer than dull ones, that clean surfaces prevent contamination, that organization saves time. These aren't insights that came from books or formal education. They emerge from daily practice, from trial and error, from the accumulated wisdom of generations of people working with fire and food. The tools themselves tell stories. The cauldron with patches welded onto worn spots repaired again and again because replacing it was too expensive. The knife handle worn smooth by thousands of hands. The bread paddle scorched from years of use. These weren't disposable items. They were investments maintained carefully, passed from one cook to another, sometimes for decades. And the innovations we've talked about, tiled floors, drainage systems, glazed windows, water pipes, these weren't just convenient upgrades. They represented changing attitudes toward kitchen work itself, a growing recognition that the people who produced food, deserved decent working conditions that efficient tools made better results possible. It was the beginning of a shift from seeing the kitchen as just a necessary evil to understanding it as a specialized workspace deserving of thoughtful design. Of course, even with the best tools available, medieval cooks faced a challenge that no implement could solve: storage and preservation of ingredients. Because what good were specialized knives and perfect cauldrons if your meat had rotted, your grain had spoiled, or your vegetables had turned to mush? The question of how to keep food edible for days, weeks, even months without any form of refrigeration was one of the defining challenges of medieval life. The solutions they developed were ingenious, sometimes surprising, and absolutely essential to survival. Let's explore the storage empire that kept Castle Kitchen supplied through every season. So we've talked about the tools, those specialized implements that made cooking possible in an age of open fires and manual labor. But here's the thing. The finest cauldron in the world doesn't help you if your meat has rotted. The sharpest knife is useless if your vegetables have turned to mush. The most expensive pepper mill means nothing if your grain stores have been invaded by weevils and rats. Medieval cooks faced a challenge that modern refrigeration has made us almost forget about. How do you keep food edible when you have no way to stop the natural processes of decay? The answer lies in understanding the castle as something more than just a residence or fortress. Beneath those great halls and lords' chambers, behind those thick stone walls we explored earlier, castles contained vast underground worlds dedicated entirely to storage. These weren't simple cellars like you might have in your basement. These were massive stone chambers, carefully engineered environments, entire ecosystems designed around the single goal of keeping food from spoiling long enough to be eaten. Let me paint you a picture of what these storage areas actually looked like, because I think it helps you understand the scale we're talking about. Imagine descending a narrow stone staircase, the temperature dropping with each step, the air becoming noticeably cooler and damper. The light from your torch flickers against wet stone walls, and then you emerge into a vaulted cellar, the ceiling arching above you like the inside of a cathedral, except instead of pews and altars, you're surrounded by enormous wooden barrels, some as tall as a person, stacked carefully and secured with iron bands. The smell hits you immediately: fermentation from wine barrels, the earthy dampness of aging cheese, the sharp salt and meat scent of preserved flesh, and underneath it all that particular mustiness of stone that's never seen sunlight. These cellars were marvels of medieval engineering. The vaulted ceilings weren't just aesthetically pleasing, they were structural solutions that allowed large underground spaces without internal support columns. The stones were carefully fitted to maintain cool temperatures year-round without becoming so damp that everything moulded. Air circulation was managed through carefully placed vents, enough to prevent stagnation, but not so much that temperature fluctuated wildly. And these spaces were organized with a precision that would impress any modern warehouse manager. Different foods required different storage conditions, and the cellarer, remember him from our hierarchy discussion, had to know exactly where everything belonged. Wine barrels were positioned in the coolest, most stable areas because wine was sensitive to temperature changes. Cheese wheels needed slightly less moisture, so they'd be stored in areas with better air circulation. Salted meats could tolerate more variation, so they might be in less optimal spots. Grains and flour required dry storage, so they'd be kept in sealed containers in the drier sections. The three main storage areas each had specific purposes. The pantry held dry goods, sacks of grain, barrels of flour-dried peas and beans stored in wooden casks. These items were relatively stable if kept dry, but they still required vigilance. Grain could develop mold if moisture got in. Flour could become infested with insects. The pantler made regular inspections, rotating stock so older supplies got used first, checking for any signs of contamination or spoilage. The larder was dedicated to meat and animal products. This is where you'd find the preserved meats we'll talk about in detail shortly hanging from iron hooks or packed in barrels of salt. But the larder also stored fresh kills when available game brought in from hunting expeditions that needed to be processed quickly before spoiling. The larder had to be kept cooler than the pantry, but not as cold as the dairy, a delicate balance achieved through careful positioning within the castle's underground network. The dairy housed milk products, butter, various types of cheese, sometimes fresh milk, though that spoiled quickly and was used immediately. Cheese was a storage miracle in its own right. By converting milk, which would sour within hours, into cheese which could last for months or even years, medieval people had discovered a way to preserve summer's abundance for winter's scarcity. Some cheeses were aged deliberately, developing stronger flavors over time. Others were meant to be eaten relatively fresh. The dairy worker needed to know which was which and monitor the aging process carefully. Now let's talk about the quantities involved, because this is where the logistics become truly staggering. A large castle feeding 50 to 100 people daily needed to store enough food to last through seasons when fresh supplies weren't available. How much food is that? Well, consider that an active adult male doing physical labour, which most castle residents were, might consume 3,000 calories daily or more. For 50 people, that's 150,000 calories every single day. Over a 6-month winter, that's approximately 27 million calories that need to be stored in some form. Let me give you some specific numbers from historical records. When preparing for a 2-day banquet, the cookbook we mentioned earlier by Mestre Chicard recommended having available, among many other things, 100 sheep, 100 pigs, substantial quantities of beef, dozens of different fish and birds, hundreds of eggs, massive amounts of grain for bread, and we haven't even gotten to the vegetables, fruits, spices and specialty items. That's for 2 days. Now multiply that by 180 days for a full winter, and you start to see the scale of storage required. Grain storage alone required enormous space. A single person might eat a pound of bread daily, which required roughly a pound of flour, which came from a bit more than a pound of grain once you account for milling losses. For a household of 60 people over 6 months, you're talking about 16,000 pounds of grain. 8 tons. Where do you put 8 tons of grain? In massive granaries, usually separate buildings with raised floors to prevent moisture from seeping up, and thick walls to maintain stable temperatures. But storing the food was only half the challenge. The real art was in preservation, in transforming perishable ingredients into forms that would last. And medieval cooks had developed an impressive array of techniques, each suited to different types of food and different lengths of storage time. Salting was the foundation of everything. Salt drew moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. But there was immense skill involved in salting properly. Too little salt and the meat would spoil anyway. Too much, and it became inedibly tough and salty. Different cuts of meat required different approaches. Thin cuts could be dry salted, rubbed with salt and left to cure. Thicker cuts needed to be immersed in brine, a solution of salt dissolved in water for days or weeks. Large castles maintained enormous vats specifically for salting meat. Picture wooden barrels easily 6 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, filled with layers of meat and salt. A pig would be butchered, cut into manageable pieces, and each piece would be laid in the barrel with a thick coating of salt. Then another layer of meat, another layer of salt, building up until the barrel was full. The salt at the bottom would eventually become saturated with liquid drawn from the meat, creating brine that helped preserve the lower layers. The quality of salt mattered enormously. The finest salt was imported from coastal regions where it was produced through solar evaporation of seawater. This salt was relatively pure, consisting mostly of sodium chloride without many other minerals. Cheaper salt might contain impurities that affected the taste of preserved meat, or didn't preserve as effectively. Wealthy households paid premium prices for quality salt, because they understood it made a difference in how long their meat lasted and how good it tasted when eventually cooked. But here's something fascinating: the salting process was carefully regulated, and the person in charge, sometimes called a larderer in large households, had to understand the science even if he couldn't explain it in modern terms. He knew that meat salted in late autumn when temperatures were cool kept better than meat salted in early autumn when it might still be warm. He knew that pork required different treatment than beef. He knew that organs like livers couldn't be preserved as long as muscle meat. This was empirical knowledge built up over generations, refined through trial and error, passed down from master to apprentice. Smoking added another dimension to preservation. After salting, meat could be hung in smokehouses where it was exposed to wood smoke for days or weeks. The smoke deposited compounds on the meat's surface that had antimicrobial properties, adding an extra layer of protection against spoilage. But smoking also transformed the flavor, adding depth and complexity that made preserved meat desirable rather than just tolerable. A well-smoked ham or side of bacon wasn't just food for when nothing fresh was available. It was a delicacy in its own right, something people actively wanted to eat. Different woods produced different smoke flavors. Applewood gave sweet, mild smoke. Oak provided stronger, more robust flavor. Beech was considered excellent for pork. The choice of wood wasn't random. It was deliberate part of the craft of creating preserved meats that would taste good, months after the smoking process ended. Vegetables presented different challenges because they didn't respond to salting the same way meat did. But medieval cooks still found ways to extend their usable life. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips, beets could be stored in cool cellars packed in sand or straw. The sand or straw absorbed excess moisture and prevented the vegetables from touching each other, which reduced rot spreading from one to another. Properly stored root vegetables could last several months. Cabbage could be fermented into what we'd recognize as sauerkraut, though they didn't call it that. The fermentation process, created by naturally occurring bacteria, produced acids that preserved the cabbage while also creating new flavors, and though they didn't know it, beneficial probiotics. Fermented vegetables were a crucial source of nutrients during winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. Onions and garlic could be dried and braided into long ropes that hung from kitchen rafters. The drying process concentrated their flavors while removing moisture that bacteria needed to grow. A well-dried onion could last through an entire winter, gradually becoming more pungent but remaining perfectly usable. Fruits offered their own preservation opportunities. Apples, if carefully selected for varieties that stored well and kept in cool, dark cellars, could last for months. Medieval people understood that one rotting apple could indeed spoil the whole barrel, so they inspected stored fruit regularly, removing any that showed signs of decay. Pears required more careful handling because they bruised easily, but they too could be stored for reasonable periods under the right conditions. For longer-term preservation, fruits could be dried. Plums became prunes, grapes became raisins, apples could be sliced thin and dried until they were leathery but still edible. This required either sun-drying in warm climates or careful drying near kitchen fires in cooler regions. The process concentrated sugars, making dried fruits intensely sweet, and providing concentrated calories that were valuable during lean times. Honey preservation was particularly interesting. Fruit could be completely submerged in honey, which was naturally antibacterial. The honey's high sugar content drew water out of any bacteria or mold that tried to grow, essentially mummifying them before they could cause spoilage. Fruit preserved in honey could last for a year or more. When you wanted to use it, you'd simply scoop out what you needed, rinse off the honey, and cook with the fruit. The honey itself could be reused multiple times, gaining flavour from the fruit it had preserved. As the 14th century progressed and sugar became more available, though still expensive, some wealthy households began making sugar preserves. The process was similar to honey preservation, but created different textures and flavours. Fruits would be boiled in concentrated sugar solutions until they candied, becoming almost like confections. These weren't just preserved foods. They were luxuries treats served at the end of elaborate meals to demonstrate the host's sophistication and resources. Underground storage wasn't just about cool temperatures. Some castles even had ice houses, the medieval equivalent of refrigerators. These were carefully constructed pits, usually dug into hillsides, or built partially underground with thick insulating walls. During winter, workers would collect ice and snow, packing it tightly into the ice house, along with layers of straw or sawdust for insulation. If done properly, this ice could last well into summer, providing a way to keep perishable foods fresh for short periods. Ice houses weren't common in every castle. They required specific conditions and considerable labour to maintain, but the largest and wealthiest households often had them. The ability to serve cold drinks in summer or present fresh fish that had been kept on ice was yet another way of demonstrating status and resources. What strikes me most about all these preservation techniques is how they represent a fundamentally different relationship with food than we have today. We expect food to be available year-round. Strawberries in December. Sure, we'll fly them in from somewhere warm. Fresh fish on Monday. No problem, it's been kept refrigerated since it was caught. But medieval people lived with seasons in a way we've almost completely forgotten. Summer was abundance. Autumn was harvest and preservation. Winter was making do with what you'd saved. Spring was the hungry gap when last year's stores were running low, and this year's crops hadn't come in yet. The entire rhythm of castle life was shaped by this cycle. The kitchen's work changed completely depending on the season. Summer meant processing fresh ingredients, preparing them for storage. Autumn was the great preservation push when everyone worked frantically to ensure enough food would last through winter. Winter meant living off preserved foods, carefully rationing stores to make them stretch. Spring meant getting creative with the dregs of what remained while eagerly anticipating fresh foods to come. And there was genuine anxiety in this system. A failed harvest could mean starvation. Spoiled stores could leave a household hungry with months to go until new supplies arrived. Castle administrators worried constantly about food security, and for good reason. The elaborate storage systems we've discussed weren't luxuries. They were necessities, the difference between survival and disaster. But these same constraints also created appreciation. When fresh strawberries appeared in late spring after months of preserved foods, it wasn't just nice. It was a revelation, a reminder of how good fresh fruit tasted, a sign that the lean times were ending. The first new bread made from the current harvest grain was celebrated. The first fresh meat from newly born livestock was an occasion. Seasonality created a calendar of anticipation and gratitude that we've lost in our world of constant availability. I think there's something worth reclaiming in that mindset. Not the scarcity or the anxiety, obviously, but the awareness, the appreciation for fresh food when it's available, the understanding that preservation is a skill and an art, not just an industrial process. When you make your own jam or pickle your own vegetables, you're connecting with practices that kept people alive for thousands of years. There's meaning in that connection. Now, all of this storage and preservation, All of these underground chambers and preservation techniques, they all existed to serve a single purpose: feeding the household. Every single day, reliably, adequately, and managing that daily challenge, coordinating fresh ingredients with preserved stores, balancing nutrition with variety, handling unexpected guests or shortfalls, that was perhaps the master cook's greatest skill. Let's explore exactly how medieval kitchens fed dozens of people day after day without the conveniences we take for granted. You know what's truly remarkable about salt? It's the only rock we eat. Think about that for a second. Of all the minerals in the earth, all the stones and crystals and compounds, salt is the only one humans deliberately seek out and consume. And in the medieval world, salt wasn't just seasoning. It was survival itself, the thin line between feast and famine, between a full belly in February and starvation before spring arrived. The medieval obsession with salt makes perfect sense once you understand what life was like without refrigeration. Imagine you've just slaughtered a pig. This is a big event, a serious commitment, because pigs were valuable. You fed this animal for months, maybe a year, investing resources in keeping it alive. And now you've killed it, and you've got hundreds of pounds of meat that in warm weather will start to spoil within hours, within days, even in cool weather. You can't eat a whole pig fast enough to prevent waste. You can't just throw it in the freezer. So what do? You salt it. You transform perishable meat into something that can last for months, maybe even a year if done properly. And this transformation, this preservation magic, was so important to medieval life that entire economic systems were built around salt production and trade. Wars were fought over salt mines. Trade routes were established specifically to move salt from producing regions to areas that needed it. The word salary comes from the Latin for salt because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given allowances to buy it. That's how valuable it was. Let me walk you through what actually happened in a medieval castle when it was time to preserve meat, because the process was both simple and incredibly nuanced. Let's say it's late autumn, November maybe, and the decision has been made to slaughter some of the livestock before winter truly sets in. Why autumn? Because feeding animals through winter was expensive and difficult. Livestock needed hay, grain, shelter. It made economic sense to slaughter most animals in autumn, preserving their meat to eat through the cold months, keeping only breeding stock and essential working animals alive until spring. The slaughter happens and suddenly the castle has fresh meat in quantities that must be dealt with immediately. The slaughterer we discussed earlier does his work breaking down the carcasses into manageable pieces, but here's where the larderer takes over, because his expertise determines whether this meat remains edible for 2 months or 6 months, whether it tastes good when eventually cooked or becomes unpleasantly tough and salty. First, he has to assess the meat itself. Not all cuts are equal for preservation. Fattier cuts like pork belly salt differently than lean cuts like ham. Organs can't be preserved as long as muscle meat and need to be eaten relatively quickly or prepared differently. Bones affect how salt penetrates tissue. The larderer is making dozens of decisions based on experience. This piece goes into dry salt, that piece into brine. These organs get cooked and eaten within days. For dry salting, the process seems straightforward but requires precision. Each piece of meat is thoroughly rubbed with salt, coating every surface, working the salt into any crevices. The salt draws moisture out of the meat through osmosis, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage. But the meat can't just be left in a pile. It needs to be arranged carefully, often in wooden troughs, or on tables with slight inclines so liquid can drain away. As moisture leaves the meat, it carries some salt with it. so the pieces need to be resalted periodically, sometimes daily for the first week. The amount of salt matters enormously. Too little, and bacteria survive in insufficiently salted areas, causing spoilage that can spread through the entire piece. Too much, and the meat becomes so salty it's nearly inedible even after soaking and cooking. Medieval cooks didn't have precise measuring tools the way we do, so they relied on experience and touch. A skilled larderer knew how a properly salted piece of meat should feel, how much salt should remain on the surface, versus being absorbed, when to add more and when to stop. Brine preservation offered different advantages. Large pieces of meat, whole hams for instance, were often submerged in barrels of brine, a saturated salt solution. The brine had to be strong enough to preserve, but not so strong it made the meat inedible. Medieval cooks tested brine strength in clever ways. One method involved floating an egg in the brine. If the egg floated high, the brine was strong enough. If it sank, more salt was needed. This wasn't just superstition. It was applied physics using the density of the egg to measure the salinity of the solution. Meat in brine needed monitoring. The brine could become contaminated, developing off flavors, or even dangerous bacteria if not maintained properly. It needed to be stirred occasionally to ensure even distribution of salt. The temperature of the storage area mattered. Too warm and even brined meat could spoil. The larderer made regular checks, sometimes daily, smelling the brine, examining the meat, looking for any signs of problems. Here's a detail that brings the whole process to life. Different types of salt produced different results. Fine salt dissolved quickly and penetrated meat evenly, making it good for delicate work or when you wanted relatively quick curing. Coarse salt was better for long-term preservation because it dissolved more slowly, providing extended protection. Some regions produce salt with slight mineral differences that affected flavor. Salt from coastal evaporation ponds tasted different from salt mined from underground deposits. An experienced larderer knew these differences and used them strategically. The best salt, as we mentioned briefly before, came from coastal regions, where seawater was channeled into shallow ponds and allowed to evaporate under the sun. This produced relatively pure salt with consistent quality, but it was expensive because the production process required significant land area and ideal weather conditions. Cheaper rock salt mined from underground deposits could work, but often contained impurities, bits of stone or other minerals that made it less effective for preservation. Wealthy households insisted on quality salt for meat preservation because they understood it made a difference. Poor quality salt could ruin expensive meat, turning a valuable resource into something barely edible. Better to pay more for good salt and ensure your winter stores remained palatable than to save money up front and lose everything to spoilage. Now let's talk about smoking, because this took preservation to another level entirely. Salted meat was edible and would keep for months, but it wasn't particularly exciting. Smoking transformed preserved meat into something people actually wanted to eat, something that had its own appeal beyond just being available when fresh meat wasn't. The smoking process usually began after meat had been salted for a period, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, depending on the cut and the intended final product. The salted meat was rinsed to remove surface salt, then hung in smokehouses, separate buildings or chambers where fires produced constant smoke without much heat. This is important. Smoking for preservation is a cool process. You want smoke, not heat. Too much heat, and you're cooking the meat, which changes the preservation chemistry and the final texture. Different woods produced remarkably different smoke characteristics. Fruit woods like apple or cherry gave sweet, mild smoke that was excellent for pork and poultry. Oak provided robust, assertive smoke that stood up to beef. Beech was traditional for bacon in many regions. Hickory, which was less common in Europe but known in some areas, gave intense flavour that some loved and others found overwhelming. The choice of wood wasn't just about flavour preferences. Different woods burned at different rates produced different amounts of smoke and deposited different compounds on the meat. A skilled smoker understood these variables and adjusted his fires accordingly. He might mix woods using oak for base smoke and adding apple wood for finishing touches. He might change woods partway through the process to build layers of flavour. The smoking duration depended on what you wanted to achieve. Light smoking, maybe just a few days, added flavour and a bit of extra preservation, but the meat still needed to be eaten relatively soon. Heavy smoking, which could last weeks with constant smoke exposure, created products that could last for months and had intense concentrated flavours that some found almost overwhelming but others prized. Have you ever wondered why bacon tastes the way it does? Why smoked ham has that distinctive flavour that's so different from fresh pork? You're tasting the results of preservation techniques developed over centuries, refined through countless experiments perfected by people who had no choice but to get it right, because their winter survival depended on it. The smoke itself contained hundreds of chemical compounds, some antimicrobial, some antioxidant, all contributing to preservation and flavour. Medieval people didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the results. They knew smoked meat kept longer than just salted meat. They knew it tasted better. They knew how to control the process to get the outcomes they wanted. And here's something I find particularly interesting: smoking created social distinctions. The quality of your smoked meat depended on your resources. Wealthy households could afford the time and space to smoke meat properly using good woods, taking weeks to develop ideal flavours. Poor families might smoke meat quickly with whatever wood was available, creating edible but less refined results. You could literally taste class differences in preserved meat. Some castles had multiple smokehouses, one for pork, one for beef, one for fish, because different products required different conditions. Fish smoking was an art unto itself, needing gentler smoke and more careful timing than meat. A fish smoked too long became dry and unpleasant. A fish undersmoked spoiled quickly. The fish smoker needed different skills than the meat smoker, and in large households these might be separate positions entirely. Drying was another crucial preservation method, especially for fish in coastal regions and for some types of meat. Air drying worked through simple dehydration. Hang a piece of fish or thin strips of meat in a cool, breezy location, and moisture gradually evaporates, leaving behind concentrated protein and flavour that bacteria can't easily colonize because there's not enough water to support their growth. Scandinavian regions became famous for dried cod, which was traded throughout Europe. The cold, dry climate was perfect for air-drying fish, producing a product that was rock-hard when fully dried, but could be rehydrated and cooked months later. It wasn't fresh fish, obviously, but it was protein, it was nutrition, and it was available when fresh fish wasn't. The medieval world also practiced combination preservation, using multiple techniques to maximize shelf life. Meat might be salted, then smoked, then also kept in a cool cellar. Fish might be salted and dried. Vegetables might be pickled in brine and also stored underground. Each additional preservation method added insurance, another barrier against spoilage. What fascinates me about all these techniques is how they represent accumulated knowledge. No single person invented meat preservation. It emerged over centuries, maybe millennia, from countless small discoveries and refinements. Someone noticed that meat kept near a smoky fire lasted longer. Someone else figured out that certain woods worked better than others. Someone realized that the brine strength mattered. Someone developed the egg floating test to check salinity. All of this knowledge was passed down through generations, father to son, master to apprentice, becoming part of the cultural inheritance that made survival possible. And there was artistry in it too. A master larderer took pride in his work. His smoked hams were recognizable by their color, their texture, their flavor. His salted beef could be distinguished from someone else's by subtle differences in cure and seasoning. This wasn't just mechanical food processing. It was craft skill, something worth doing well for its own sake. The economics of preservation shaped entire regional cuisines. Areas with good salt sources developed robust preserving cultures. Coastal regions with access to both salt and fish became centers of preserved seafood production. Inland areas with excellent smokehouses traded their smoked meats for coastal salt fish. We think of regional cuisines as being about local ingredients, and they are, but they're also about local preservation techniques, about what people learned to keep through seasons when fresh food wasn't available. Modern food preservation, canning and freezing and refrigeration has made life immeasurably easier and safer. We've virtually eliminated foodborne illness from improperly preserved foods. We can eat a more varied diet year-round than any medieval noble could have imagined. But we've also lost something in the process. We've lost the knowledge of how to preserve food ourselves, the skills that were once essential survival tools. We've lost the appreciation for how clever these old techniques were, how much thought and observation went into developing them. There's a quiet satisfaction in making your own bacon, curing your own salmon, smoking your own cheese. You're not doing it because you have to. You're doing it because there's meaning in the connection to these old ways, because the results taste different and often better than industrial products, because it's pleasant to know you could feed yourself even if the grocery store's closed. That knowledge, that capability, it changes how you think about food. As we've explored preservation, we've seen how medieval people extended summer's abundance into winter's scarcity, how they transformed perishable ingredients into stable stores that could last for months. But preservation was only part of the equation. All these stored foods, all these salted meats and dried vegetables and wheels of aging cheese, they existed to serve a fundamental purpose, feeding everyone in the castle every single day, reliably and adequately. Managing that daily challenge required a level of planning and coordination that might surprise you. Let's see how medieval kitchens turned preserved stores and fresh ingredients into actual meals for dozens of hungry people. There's something almost magical about the way medieval people thought about spices. Today we shake pepper onto our eggs without a second thought, maybe sprinkle some cinnamon into our coffee, grab a jar of cumin from the grocery store for a few dollars. It's mundane every day, no big deal. But in the 14th century, spices were power. They were wealth. They were medicine, mysticism, and social currency, all ground into tiny fragments that could transform not just the taste of food, but the entire meaning of a meal. And understanding how medieval cooks used spices and why they used them the way they did opens a window into a worldview so different from ours that it can feel almost alien. Let me start with a number that should make you pause. 30 grams of pepper, about 1 ounce, cost the equivalent of a full day's wages for a labourer. 1 ounce. That's roughly 2 tablespoons of peppercorns. For what an ordinary worker earned by toiling from sunrise to sunset, carrying stones or ploughing fields or hauling water, he could buy 2 tablespoons of pepper. Think about that proportion. If you translated that to modern terms, we're talking about pepper being more expensive than many cuts of meat, more valuable than fine wine, more precious than most people's clothing. And pepper wasn't even the most expensive spice. Saffron cost exponentially more because it had to be harvested by hand from crocus flowers, each flower producing only 3 tiny stigmas that had to be carefully plucked. It took thousands of flowers to produce a single ounce of saffron. The labour involved was staggering. So when a medieval recipe called for saffron, and many of them did, it was a statement. It said, "I have resources, I have connections, I have access to luxury goods from distant lands." Serving a dish flavoured with saffron was like serving your guests champagne and caviar today, except even more exclusive because at least champagne can be produced in large quantities once you've figured out the process. But here's where things get really interesting. Spices weren't just status symbols. Medieval people genuinely believed they were essential for health, and this belief was rooted in medical theories that dominated European thought for centuries. The theory of the four humours, which originated with ancient Greek physicians and was elaborated throughout the medieval period, held that the human body contained four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping these humours in perfect balance. Disease meant imbalance, and different foods, including spices, were classified according to their effects on these humours. According to the scholars D. Eleanor Scully and Terence Scully, who've done extensive research on medieval culinary medicine, spices including sugar were considered to be simply that varieties of drugs to be employed only with a full conscious understanding of their respective strengths and virtues. Drugs. Not seasonings, not flavourings, but drugs. Medieval cooks, at least those working for nobles and the wealthy, needed to understand medical theory because they were essentially practicing preventive medicine with every meal they prepared. Each spice was classified on two scales, hot to cold and dry to moist. Pepper was considered hot and dry. Ginger was hot and moist. Cinnamon was hot and dry, but less intensely than pepper. These classifications weren't arbitrary. They were based on how the spice made you feel, what it seemed to do to your body. Pepper made you sweat, made your mouth burn so clearly it was heating. Ginger seemed to settle upset stomachs and promote digestion, suggesting moistening and warming properties. The cook's job was to balance dishes according to humoral theory. If you were serving fish, which was considered cold and moist, you'd season it with hot, dry spices like pepper to counterbalance its natural properties. If you were preparing beef, which was thought to be hot and dry already, you might use more moderate spices or even cooling ingredients to prevent the dish from becoming too heating and potentially causing fever or inflammation in the person eating it. Now here's where it gets even more complex. Individual diners might have different humoral constitutions. Young people were thought to be naturally warmer and moister than old people. Men were typically considered hotter and drier than women. Different seasons affected your humoral balance. Summer heat might make you too warm and dry. Winter cold might make you too cold and moist. A truly sophisticated cook would adjust seasoning based on who was eating when they were eating, and what other foods they'd be consuming in the same meal. This sounds incredibly complicated, and it was, but it also reveals something profound about medieval culture. They took food seriously as medicine. They believed deeply that what you ate directly affected your physical and mental health. And you know what? They weren't entirely wrong. Modern nutritional science has confirmed that many spices do have genuine health benefits. Ginger really does help with nausea. Turmeric has anti-inflammatory properties. Cinnamon can help regulate blood sugar. The medieval understanding of why these things worked was inaccurate, but the observation that they worked was sound. Let me tell you about sugar because its story perfectly illustrates this medical mindset. Today we think of sugar as at best a guilty pleasure, and at worst a health hazard. We're constantly being warned to reduce our sugar intake. But in the 13th century and earlier, sugar was used exclusively for medicinal purposes. It was so expensive and so rare that only apothecaries, the medieval equivalent of pharmacists, stocked it. If you needed sugar, you went to the same place you'd go for other medicines, and you used it sparingly as treatment for specific ailments. But something changed during the 14th and 15th centuries. Sugar became more widely available, though still expensive, and it began appearing as a common condiment at prosperous tables. Why, partly because of increased trade connections making it less rare, but also because of humoral theory. According to these medical beliefs, sugar was classified as moderately warm and moist. And what else was moderately warm and moist? The ideal human temperament, the perfect balance of humours that represented optimal health. So sugar wasn't just delicious, it was actually considered healthy, beneficial, something that promoted good humoral balance. Nobles started using it more liberally because they believed it was good for them. They'd sprinkle it on meat, dissolve it in wine, use it in sauces and preserves. The idea that sugar might be harmful would have seemed absurd. It was medicine. It was balance. How could something that brought you closer to the ideal temperament possibly be bad? Of course, they were wrong about the mechanism, but there's something almost touching about the certainty with which they believed this. They thought they understood how the body worked, and they made logical decisions based on that understanding. The fact that the underlying theory was flawed doesn't make their reasoning process any less human or relatable. Now let's talk about the social symbolism of spices, because this is where things get really juicy. Medieval nobles were acutely aware of which spices were most expensive. They knew down to the penny what things cost, and they used this knowledge strategically. When you invited someone to dinner, the spices you used sent clear messages about how much you valued that person, how much honour you were willing to bestow on them. Imagine you're a minor lord hosting a bishop. You want to impress this bishop because the church has enormous political and social power. So your master cook prepares dishes heavily seasoned with saffron, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. The bishop tastes the food and immediately understands this meal cost a fortune. This level of spice use represents a significant percentage of your annual income. You're demonstrating both your wealth and your respect for him. Message received. But here's the flip side. If you use cheap spices, or worse, none at all, when hosting someone of high status, you are essentially insulting them. You are saying, "You're not worth the expense." Social relationships in medieval society were built on these kinds of symbolic gestures, and food was one of the primary languages of status and respect. Salt occupied a unique position in this spice hierarchy. It was essential, absolutely necessary for preservation and flavouring, but it wasn't exotic or rare the way pepper was. So salt became a different kind of status symbol. The container that held salt at a feast was what mattered. Wealthy nobles commissioned elaborate salt cellars, sometimes made from gold or silver, intricately decorated, shaped like ships or castles or mythological creatures. These weren't just functional items. They were art pieces, displays of wealth and taste. And here's a detail that I absolutely love. There was an actual phrase in medieval culture about sitting above the salt, or below the salt. The lord's table would have an elaborate salt cellar placed at a specific point. People seated above it toward the lord were honoured guests and high-status individuals. People seated below the salt were of lesser importance. Your physical position relative to a container of salt indicated your social status. Can you imagine? The salt shaker on your table right now would have been a marker of social hierarchy, determining who got respect and who didn't. The Duke of Berry, one of the wealthiest nobles in 14th century France, owned a golden salt cellar called a nef, shaped like a ship that was so elaborate and expensive it appeared in illuminated manuscripts showing him at feasts. That salt cellar wasn't about holding salt. It was about announcing to everyone in the room, "I have more money than you can possibly imagine." Whoa. Spices also had to be purchased from specialized sources, and this added another layer of complexity. In many areas, cooks couldn't just go to a market and buy pepper or saffron. They had to go to an apothecary, that same place where medicines were sold. The apothecary would measure out small quantities of precious spices, sometimes explaining their properties and recommended uses. This reinforced the connection between spices and medicine. You were buying them from someone who understood drugs and healing, not just from a random merchant. Some castles, particularly large ones with sophisticated kitchens, employed a specialized servant called a spicer, who was specifically responsible for managing the spice supply. The spicer kept the spices locked away because they were valuable enough to steal. He doled out precise amounts to the cooks as needed, keeping careful records of what was used and when. This wasn't paranoia. It was practical accounting for items that genuinely represented significant portions of the household budget. Different spices also had different symbolic associations beyond just their cost. Cinnamon was associated with the exotic East with biblical references to the Garden of Eden. Cloves were believed to have special properties related to memory and mental clarity. Nutmeg was sometimes thought to be an aphrodisiac. These symbolic meanings layered onto the medical theories and the status implications, creating a rich tapestry of significance around what might seem like simple seasonings. And here's something that surprised me when I first learned it. Medieval people could actually taste the difference between high-quality and low-quality spices much more readily than most modern people can. Because spices were so expensive, because they mattered so much, people developed refined palates for them. They could tell if pepper was fresh or stale, if saffron had been adulterated with cheaper flowers, if cinnamon was the expensive Ceylon variety or the cheaper cassia. This wasn't snobbery for its own sake. It was informed appreciation born from scarcity and significance. Think about how this shaped the master cook's expertise. He needed to know not just how flavors combined, but the entire web of meaning surrounding each spice. He needed to understand medical theory well enough to balance humors. He needed to know market prices so he could use expensive spices strategically where they'd be most noticed and appreciated. He needed to recognize quality so the Lord wasn't cheated by dishonest merchants. He needed to understand symbolic associations so dishes conveyed appropriate messages. This wasn't just cooking. This was diplomacy, medicine, economics, and art all rolled into one. The international trade networks that supplied these spices were themselves remarkable. Pepper came from India, travelling thousands of miles overland and by sea. Cinnamon came from Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Cloves and nutmeg came from the Spice Islands in what's now Indonesia. Saffron was cultivated in various Mediterranean regions. Each spice had its own trade route, its own chain of merchants and transporters, its own risks and challenges. Wars could disrupt spice supplies. Storms could sink ships carrying precious cargo. Political changes could close trade routes entirely. When spices arrived at European ports, they'd already changed hands multiple times, with each intermediary adding markup. By the time they reached a castle kitchen in England or France, they'd travelled farther than most people in that kitchen would travel in their entire lives. Holding a peppercorn in your hand meant holding something that had crossed deserts, sailed seas, passed through dozens of different cultures and languages. There was genuine wonder in that. I think one of the saddest transformations in our modern relationship with food is how we've lost that sense of wonder about spices. We have access to flavors from around the world available cheaply and conveniently, and we barely notice. We don't think about the cinnamon in our coffee as a miracle of global trade. We don't appreciate pepper as a luxury that our ancestors would have treasured. Abundance has bred indifference. But maybe there's something we can reclaim from the medieval attitude. Not the medical theories, those were genuinely incorrect, but the intentionality, the mindfulness about what we put in our food and why. Medieval cooks thought carefully about every pinch of spice, considering its effects, its meanings, its costs. They treated seasoning as a serious decision rather than a casual afterthought. What if we approached our own cooking with even a fraction of that thoughtfulness? And there's also something to be said for their understanding that food is about more than just nutrition. It's about showing care, demonstrating respect, creating experiences that matter. When a medieval lord spent a fortune on spices for a feast, he wasn't being foolish or wasteful. He was investing in relationships, in reputation, in the social fabric that held his world together. The food meant something beyond the meal itself. As we move forward in understanding these medieval kitchens with their complex hierarchies and their precious spices and their sophisticated preservation techniques, we're going to explore one more crucial element, the daily challenge of feeding everyone. Because all the spices in the world, all the elaborate theories and expensive ingredients, all the specialized tools and skilled workers, they all came together with a single fundamental purpose. People needed to eat, every single day, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, and making that happen consistently, reliably, efficiently was perhaps the most impressive achievement of the medieval castle kitchen. Let's see exactly how they managed it. Here's a question that keeps me up at night sometimes. How did they do it? How did a medieval kitchen staff working with open fires and manual labour manage to feed 50, 60, sometimes over 100 people twice a day, every single day for years on end without ever running out of food or having a complete breakdown? The logistics alone are mind-boggling when you really think about them. We struggle to cook dinner for 6 people without consulting recipes on our phones and running to the grocery store for forgotten ingredients. Medieval cooks were feeding armies of hungry mouths with none of our conveniences, and somehow they made it work. Let me give you some context about who exactly needed feeding in a typical castle, because understanding the numbers helps you appreciate the challenge. At the very top you had the lord and his immediate family. Depending on the household, that might be 3 people or it might be 10. Then you had the lord's household knights, men who'd sworn service to him and lived within the castle. That could easily be another dozen men. Add clergy, because most castles had at least a chaplain and possibly other religious figures. Add the administrative staff, the steward, the chamberlain, various clerks and accountants. Add the skilled workers, the master cook, and his team, the marshal, who ran the stables, the blacksmith, the carpenter, and then you had all the regular servants. Kitchen workers we've already discussed, but there were also grooms for the horses' pages and squires. If this was a household that trained young nobles' maids who cleaned chambers and tended to the lady laundresses, stable boys, guards at the gates, messengers. In a moderately prosperous castle, you could easily have 50 to 70 people who needed to eat daily. In a major noble household or a royal residence, the number could swell to several hundred. Every single one of these people needed breakfast and dinner, the 2 main meals of the medieval day. And here's the crucial part: they didn't all eat the same food. The social hierarchy that defined everything else in medieval life extended right down to what appeared on your plate. The lord expected fine white bread made from wheat, roasted meat, seasoned with expensive spices, wine from his best barrels. The servants got coarser bread made from barley or rye, simpler stews and pottages, small beer or watered ale. This wasn't cruelty exactly, though it seems harsh to modern sensibilities. It was how the world worked. Your food reflected your status. So the kitchen staff wasn't just making one meal. They were essentially preparing multiple different meals simultaneously, each calibrated to the social rank of the people who'd be eating it. The complexity of this coordination is staggering when you think about it. You're managing different ingredients, different cooking techniques, different timing, all happening at once in the same physical space. Let's walk through what a typical day's meal planning might look like. The master cook arriving early would first consider what day it was in the religious calendar. because this determined what could be served. Wednesday, Friday and Saturday were fast days when meat and eggs were forbidden. The evenings before major religious holidays were also fast days. And then there was Lent, 40 days before Easter, when strict fasting rules applied. On fast days, the kitchen had to serve fish, vegetables and grain dishes without any meat or animal products except fish. You might think, well, that's simple, just serve fish. But fish had its own complications. Fresh fish was only available if you were near the coast or a good river, and even then, keeping it fresh without refrigeration meant it had to be cooked the same day it was caught or purchased. Most inland castles relied heavily on preserved fish, salted cod, smoked herring, dried fish that had to be soaked for hours before cooking to remove excess salt and rehydrate the flesh. These preserved fish could be less expensive than fresh meat, but preparing them well required skill. Badly prepared salt fish was tough, overly salty, unpleasant to eat. Good cooks knew how to soak it properly, how to season it to balance the salt, how to cook it so it remained tender. On non-fast days, meat was the centerpiece of noble meals, and this created its own planning challenges. What meat was available, if it was hunting season, and the Lord's huntsman had brought in fresh game deer or boar or wild birds, then the kitchen might feature roasted venison or spit-roasted boar for the high table, but you couldn't count on fresh game being available consistently. Most days the kitchen relied on a combination of domestically raised animals and preserved meats from the stores we discussed earlier. Pork was the most common meat for regular consumption, because pigs were efficient to raise. They didn't need much space or attention, they'd eat almost anything, including kitchen scraps, and they produced a lot of meat relative to their upkeep. A castle that kept pigs could slaughter them as needed throughout the year, providing fresh pork regularly. Chickens served a similar purpose, providing both meat and eggs, though eggs were forbidden on fast days, so their utility was limited during Lent and weekly fast days. Beef was less common for regular meals because cattle were valuable as working animals and dairy producers. You didn't casually slaughter a good plough ox just because you wanted beef for dinner. Cattle that were slaughtered were usually old animals no longer able to work, which meant tougher meat that required longer, slower cooking to become tender. Mutton and lamb were more common in regions with strong wool industries where sheep were raised primarily for wool, but also provided meat as a secondary product. The master cook would assess what was available both fresh and from the stores and plan accordingly. Let's say it's a Tuesday in late autumn, not a fast day, and the kitchen has access to fresh pork from a recently slaughtered pig, some preserved beef from the seller's chickens for the higher status diners, and the usual stores of grains, vegetables and spices. He might plan roasted pork for the Lord's table, stewed beef for the household knights, and upper servants' chicken for any special guests, and a hearty pottage made from grain and vegetables for the lower servants. But planning the menu was only the beginning. Next came procurement, making sure all the necessary ingredients were actually available. Some things could be taken from stores, preserved meats grain for bread, dried peas, or beans, onions, and garlic from the rafters, spices from the locked spice chest. Other things needed to be obtained fresh that day. The castle gardens, if it was the growing season, could provide fresh vegetables and herbs. Otherwise, vegetables came from the stores or had to be purchased from local farmers or markets. Here's where the procurement network became crucial. Many ingredients had local sources and were supplied fresh on the day they'd be used. A castle didn't stockpile fresh vegetables for weeks. They bought or harvested them as needed. This meant maintaining relationships with local farmers, knowing who had the best produce, who could be relied on to deliver on time, who might have specialty items available. The pantler or steward usually handled these relationships, but the master cook had input, rejecting inferior ingredients or requesting specific items for planned dishes. For special occasions or when particular ingredients weren't available locally, procurement could become much more complex. There are historical records of messengers being sent on multi-day journeys to purchase specific items. A ton of rare wine might require sending someone all the way to a distant city. Exotic spices came through merchants who themselves had travelled enormous distances or bought from long trade chains. Fresh seafood for an inland castle meant sending riders to the coast and back in a desperate race against spoilage. Many castles, especially larger ones, maintained their own gardens specifically to supply the kitchen. These weren't ornamental gardens. They were working vegetable plots, herb gardens, sometimes orchards. A well-maintained castle garden could provide fresh parsley, mint, sage, rosemary, thyme, and other herbs that were essential to medieval cooking. It might grow onions, leeks, cabbages, carrots, peas, beans. It might have fruit trees producing apples, pears, plums, quinces. The garden was usually the responsibility of a specific gardener, but the kitchen staff worked closely with him, requesting what they needed, timing planting so ingredients would be available when required. Medieval garden management was surprisingly sophisticated. Gardeners understood crop rotation to maintain soil fertility. They knew which plants grew well together and which should be separated. They saved seeds from the best plants to ensure good harvests in following years. Once ingredients were secured, preparation could begin, and this is where timing became absolutely critical. Remember, there were no thermostats to adjust, no timers to set. Everything was done by experience and judgment. Bread baking might start very early because bread needed time to rise, then bake, then cool slightly before serving. The baker had to calculate backward from when bread needed to be on the table to determine when to start mixing dough. Meat roasting required similar advanced planning. A large roast needed hours to cook properly, and it had to be started at exactly the right time to be ready when needed. Too early and it sat around getting cold. Too late and hungry, nobles waited impatiently while the kitchen scrambled. The spit boys we discussed earlier might spend 3 or 4 hours turning a large roast, maintaining consistent rotation, basting it periodically with drippings to keep it moist and flavourful. Stews and pottages were more forgiving in terms of timing, because they could simmer for extended periods without harm, but they still required attention. Ingredients had to be added in the right sequence. Tough meats went in early to give them time to become tender. Vegetables were added later so they didn't turn to mush. Seasonings were adjusted throughout cooking as flavours developed and concentrated. The coordination required to have everything ready at the same time is genuinely impressive. In a modern restaurant kitchen, the head chef calls out orders and coordinates timing, and that system descends directly from medieval castle kitchens. The master cook needed to know exactly what state each dish was in at any given moment, when the bread would be ready, how much longer the roast needed, whether the stew required more seasoning if the fish was cooked through. And all of this happened twice daily. Breakfast was usually lighter and simpler, but it still needed to appear at the expected time for dozens of people. Dinner, the main meal served around midday or early afternoon, was the major production. The timing mattered not just for food quality, but for the broader rhythm of castle life. The lord expected to eat at certain times. The household staff organised their work around meal times. Delays created ripple effects throughout the entire day's schedule. Portion control was another fascinating challenge. How much food should you prepare? Too little, and people went hungry, which was both a practical problem and a social embarrassment. Too much, and you wasted expensive resources. Medieval cooks developed surprisingly accurate intuitions about quantities. They knew roughly how much bread each person consumed, how much meat satisfied different appetites, how much pottage filled bowls for the lower servants. But quantities varied based on circumstances. Hard physical labour meant people ate more. Cold weather increased appetite. The presence of guests meant serving extra to demonstrate hospitality and abundance. The master cook had to factor in all these variables when planning amounts to prepare. Leftovers weren't really a problem in the way we think of them today. Any decent food that remained after meals was usually consumed by servants, or in some charitable households distributed to the poor who waited outside castle gates. Nothing was truly wasted because even the scraps had value. Bones went to make stock. Stale bread could be ground into breadcrumbs or soaked in liquid for other dishes. Fat was saved for cooking or making soap. Religious feast days and fast days created a particularly complex calendar that the kitchen had to navigate. Lent alone meant 40 days of fish and vegetables, which required planning weeks in advance to ensure adequate supplies of preserved fish and enough variety to keep meals interesting despite the restrictions. Other major feast days, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost Saints' days meant elaborate meals that might require special ingredients or extended preparation. One of the things I find most remarkable is how this system accommodated unexpected guests, which were common in an age when travel was slow and communication was difficult. Someone might arrive at your castle gates expecting hospitality, as was customary among nobles, and suddenly you had extra mouths to feed. The kitchen had to be able to scale up on short notice, drawing on stores to supplement what had been planned. Large noble households sometimes fed hundreds of people daily. The royal court, when in residence at a particular castle, might swell to over 1,000 people, all expecting appropriate meals. The logistics of feeding that many people are mind-boggling. You're essentially running a medieval version of a large cafeteria or restaurant, except your customers are demanding. Your resources are limited, and you can't just order more supplies from a distributor. Historical records from very large households give us glimpses of the scale involved. One account describes a major feast requiring multiple ovens, fired continuously, dozens of cooks and servants working in shifts procurement networks stretching across entire regions to gather necessary ingredients. The coordination wasn't just kitchen work, it was project management, logistics, supply chain operations. And they did all of this day after day, year after year, without computers, without modern communication systems, without any of the tools we consider essential for large-scale food service. They relied on experience, on established routines, on clear hierarchies that meant everyone knew their role, on communication systems that were verbal and immediate rather than written and abstract. There's something both humbling and inspiring about imagining those medieval kitchens at midday fires, roaring dozens of people moving with practiced coordination, the master cook overseeing everything with the concentrated focus of someone who knows that failure means hungry nobles and angry lords, the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filling the air, the heat radiating from ovens and open fires, the constant motion of servants carrying ingredients, stirring pots, turning spits, checking bread, adjusting fires, and somehow miraculously it worked. Bread appeared on tables, meat was carved and served, stews were ladled into bowls, beer flowed, people ate, were satisfied, and the whole cycle began again for the next meal. Understanding this daily rhythm, this relentless logistics challenge that medieval kitchens faced and met, gives us a new appreciation for the complexity of castle life. These weren't simple times or simple people. They were solving genuinely difficult problems with ingenuity and determination. But all this daily cooking, all this coordination of ingredients and timing and portioning it all, relied on techniques that had been refined over centuries. The actual methods of cooking, the ways fire was used to transform raw ingredients into finished dishes, these formed the foundation that made everything else possible. Let's explore the cooking techniques themselves. The art and science of turning meat, grain and vegetables into meals that satisfied everyone from the lord in his great hall to the scullion in the kitchen corner. There's a particular kind of knowledge that can only be gained through your hands, through doing something so many times that your body understands it in ways your mind can't quite articulate. Modern cooking has tried to eliminate this kind of knowledge, replacing it with precise temperatures and exact timings. Set your oven to 350 degrees, cook for 23 minutes, use a meat thermometer to check for an internal temperature of 165 degrees. Everything measured, everything controlled, everything predictable. But medieval cooks had none of that. They couldn't turn a dial to adjust heat. They couldn't set a timer. They couldn't check internal temperatures with a digital thermometer. Everything they knew about cooking came from experience, from observation, from developing an almost instinctive understanding of how fire and food interacted. And the remarkable thing is they were incredibly good at it. They produced food that satisfied demanding nobles, that impressed important guests, that kept entire households fed and reasonably happy, all without a single modern convenience. Let me take you inside the actual cooking process, because understanding how medieval cooks worked with fire reveals a kind of mastery that I think we've lost in our age of temperature-controlled ovens and induction cooktops. The foundation of everything was the open fire, and fire is fundamentally unpredictable. Wood burns at different rates depending on its moisture content, its density, how it's arranged. Flames rise and fall. Heat radiates unevenly. A medieval cook couldn't just set the temperature. They had to read the fire, understand its moods, adjust constantly to maintain the conditions each dish required. Spit roasting was perhaps the most iconic medieval cooking technique, and it was much more complex than you might imagine. The basic concept seems simple enough: skewer meat on a metal rod, suspend it over or near a fire, rotate it so all sides cook evenly. But execution required genuine skill and, honestly, a lot of physical endurance. Let's talk about roasting a boar, which was a centerpiece of many medieval feasts and shows you everything involved in large-scale spit roasting. A whole boar could easily weigh 150 pounds or more. That's not something you casually stick on a stick and spin around. First, the animal had to be properly prepared. Gutted, cleaned, sometimes stuffed with herbs or other meats, then secured onto a massive iron spit that might be 6 or 7 feet long and thick enough to support all that weight without bending. The spit was mounted on supports that held it at the right distance from the fire. Too close and the outside burned while the inside stayed raw. Too far, and it never cooked properly, just dried out slowly without developing the crispy, flavorful exterior that made roasted meat so desirable. Medieval cooks judged distance by experience and by holding their hands near the meat to feel the heat intensity. They'd adjust the spit supports, raising or lowering the meat, moving it closer or farther from flames, based on how things were progressing. And then came the rotation. Remember our spit boys from earlier. This was their moment, their hours and hours of arm-burning labour. The spit had to turn constantly, or at least very regularly, to ensure even cooking. Stop turning for too long, and one side burned while the other stayed underdone. But turning 150 pounds of meat on a long iron rod, even with the mechanical advantage of a handle, was exhausting work. Spit boys worked in shifts, sometimes trading off when their arms gave out, maintaining that steady rotation that was absolutely essential. They weren't just turning blindly, though. They had to watch the meat, looking for signs of how it was cooking. As fat rendered out, it dripped down into the fire, causing flare-ups that could scorch the surface. The boys had to be ready to pull the meat back temporarily when flames got too intense, then move it closer again once things calmed down. They basted the roast periodically using long-handled brushes or ladles to coat it with its own drippings, or with a mixture of fat and seasonings. This basting kept the exterior moist, prevented it from drying out too much, and added flavour. How did they know when the meat was done? Not with a thermometer, that's for sure. They watched for the skin to crisp and brown, for juices running clear rather than pink, for the meat to shrink slightly on the spit. Experienced cooks could tell by the smell, by the sound of fat dripping, by pressing the meat with a finger to test its firmness. They developed an almost supernatural ability to judge doneness through these indirect signals. And here's something that really brings it home: spit roasting a whole boar could take 6, 7, even 8 hours. Imagine standing in front of a roaring fire for 8 hours, constantly turning, constantly basting, constantly monitoring in a room that's already hot from other fires burning for other dishes. The heat would be overwhelming. The smoke would make your eyes water. Your arms would feel like they were going to fall off. But you couldn't stop because a feast depended on this roast being perfect. Smaller roast chickens or rabbits or joints of beef required less time, but the same attention to detail. Each type of meat roasted differently. Poultry needed higher heat to crisp the skin without drying out the delicate flesh. Beef could handle more moderate heat over longer periods. Pork fell somewhere in between. A skilled cook knew these differences instinctively and adjusted fire intensity and roasting time accordingly. Boiling and stewing represented a completely different approach to cooking, one that was actually more common in medieval kitchens than roasting, because it was more forgiving and could feed more people with less effort. But don't let boiling fool you into thinking this was simple or crude. Medieval boiled and stewed dishes could be remarkably sophisticated. The pottage, which we've mentioned several times, was the workhorse of medieval cooking. At its most basic, a pottage was grain or legumes cooked in liquid until soft and thick. But calling it just grain and water is like calling a fine wine just fermented grapes. The reality was much more interesting. A simple pottage for servants might indeed be fairly plain barley or oats, cooked in water or weak broth, maybe with some onions and salt for flavour. This was filling, nutritious enough to sustain hard physical labour, and could be made in enormous quantities with minimal expense. But pottages for the Lord's table were entirely different creatures. These might start with a rich meat broth made from roasted bones and aromatic vegetables. The grain or legumes would be carefully selected, maybe imported spelt or high-quality wheat. As the pottage cooked, cooks would add ingredients in stages harder vegetables early, so they softened properly tender ones later to preserve their texture. Herbs and spices were added thoughtfully, building layers of flavour. And there was a whole category of pottages that weren't grain-based at all. White pottages, which were particularly fashionable in the 14th century, were made from almonds ground into paste and mixed with broth to create a creamy white soup. These were often served on fast days when dairy wasn't allowed, providing richness and body without violating religious restrictions. Making almond milk was labour-intensive. Almonds had to be blanched to remove skins ground to a fine paste with mortar and pestle, then mixed with liquid and strained through cloth to remove any remaining solids. The result was smooth, rich, almost luxurious, despite containing no actual dairy. The key to good stewing was managing the heat. A rolling boil made meat tough and destroyed delicate vegetables. A gentle simmer where the liquid barely bubbled allowed tough cuts to become tender through long, slow cooking while preserving flavours. Medieval cooks controlled heat by adjusting how close the cauldron hung to the fire using those pot hooks and chains we discussed earlier. They'd raise the pot farther from flames to reduce heat, lower it closer to increased temperature, making constant small adjustments based on what the dish needed. Frying was less common than roasting or boiling, partly because it required a fair amount of fat or oil, which was expensive, but it was definitely part of the medieval cook's repertoire. Fritter small pieces of meat or vegetables dipped in batter and fried in hot fat appeared at noble tables regularly. Rissoles, something like medieval croquettes, were made from finely chopped meat mixed with spices, formed into small balls or patties, and fried until crispy. The challenge with frying was temperature control. Fat that's too hot burns the exterior before the interior cooks. Fat that's not hot enough results in greasy, soggy food that absorbs excessive oil. Medieval cooks tested fat temperature by dropping small pieces of bread into it. If the bread browned in a few seconds, the fat was ready. If it burned immediately, too hot. If it just sat there getting greasy, not hot enough. This bread dropping test was surprisingly accurate and required no equipment beyond the cook's observation and experience. Baking encompassed more than just bread, though bread was certainly the most important baked good in medieval life. By the late 14th century, pies had become increasingly popular, and these weren't always sweet desserts the way we think of pies today. Savoury pies filled with meat, fish, vegetables, or combinations thereof were common. The crust served multiple purposes. It held the filling during cooking. It protected the contents from direct heat, allowing slower, more even cooking, and in some cases it was edible, adding its own texture and flavour to the dish. Early medieval pies often used what was called huff paste, a thick, hard crust that wasn't really meant to be eaten. It was essentially a disposable cooking container made from flour and water, tough enough to hold shape in the oven, but not pleasant to eat. But as the 14th century progressed, proper short crust pastry began appearing in recipes. This was made with fat worked into flour, creating a tender, flaky crust that was definitely meant to be consumed. The development of edible pie crust was actually a significant culinary innovation, expanding what cooks could do with baked dishes. Baking required understanding how ovens worked, and medieval bread ovens were their own specialized world. After firing the oven and removing the embers, the temperature started high and gradually decreased as the stone walls radiated their stored heat. Bakers used this temperature gradient strategically. Items needing high heat, like certain breads or pies with thick crusts, went in first. As the oven cooled, they'd put in items that needed gentler heat. A skilled baker could sequence multiple different baked goods through a single firing, maximizing efficiency and fuel use. One technique I find particularly clever is how medieval cooks clarified broths and jellies. Clear, translucent broth was considered superior to cloudy broth, both aesthetically and according to medical theories about digestibility. But getting broth truly clear was tricky. As meat and bones simmered, proteins and fats created cloudiness. Medieval cooks discovered that egg whites could clarify broth. They'd add beaten egg whites to the pot, then heat it gently. The egg whites would coagulate, trapping the particles that caused cloudiness, and the whole mass could be strained out, leaving crystal clear broth behind. This same principle worked for jellies, which were popular at medieval feasts. Jellies were made by boiling animal parts rich in collagen, feet, ears, hides, until the collagen dissolved into the liquid. As this liquid cooled, it formed a gel, but it would be cloudy and unappetizing unless clarified with egg whites. The result after clarification was a clear jewel-like jelly that could be molded into elaborate shapes and served as a delicacy. The late 14th century saw increasing interest in what we might call presentation cooking, dishes that looked impressive alongside tasting good. Cooks began using natural food colorings to make dishes more visually striking. Saffron provided yellow and gold colors. Spinach juice or parsley created greens. Elderberries or imported sandalwood gave reds. These weren't just random prettification. Colour had meaning in medieval thought, connecting to humoral theory and symbolic associations. What strikes me about all these techniques is how much they relied on the cook's senses and judgment. A modern recipe might say simmer for 30 minutes at a gentle boil. A medieval cook would simmer until the meat was tender, checking by testing with a knife or fork, adjusting time based on the specific piece of meat, the intensity of the fire, the altitude, the weather, all these variables they couldn't control but learn to work with. This meant that two cooks making the same dish might produce quite different results, and that was acceptable, even expected. Cooking was understood to be an art where individual skill and judgment mattered. The best cooks weren't following recipes mechanically. They were interpreting guidelines, adjusting on the fly, using their accumulated experience to make hundreds of small decisions that collectively determined whether a dish was merely adequate or truly excellent. There's something both humbling and liberating about this approach. Humbling because it reminds us how much genuine skill went into tasks we now think of as simple, but liberating because it suggests cooking doesn't have to be about perfect precision and following instructions exactly. There's room for judgment, for adaptation, for developing your own feel for how things work. Medieval cooks were also surprisingly innovative within their constraints. The late 14th century saw recipes becoming more detailed and complex, incorporating techniques that showed real culinary sophistication. Instructions began appearing for things like making light, fluffy pastries by incorporating air through repeated folding. Methods for achieving specific textures in sauces through careful heating and stirring. Techniques for layering flavors by adding ingredients in specific sequences. And they understood perhaps better than we do that cooking was fundamentally about transformation. Fire didn't just heat food. It changed, it created new textures and flavors, made things digestible that weren't before. They saw this transformation as almost magical, a kind of alchemy, where base ingredients became something greater than their parts. The coordination required when multiple cooking techniques were happening simultaneously is worth appreciating. During preparation for a major feast, you might have roasts on spits, stews simmering in cauldrons, bread baking in ovens, fritters frying in pans, and sauces being carefully prepared over gentle heat, all at the same time, all requiring attention, all at different stages of completion. The master cook was conducting an orchestra of fire and food, keeping everything moving forward, ensuring things finished at the right times, maintaining quality across dozens of different dishes. And they did all of this consistently, successfully, for centuries, proving that sophisticated cooking doesn't require sophisticated equipment. It requires knowledge, skill, attention, and a deep understanding of how your tools and ingredients work. What we've lost in our modern kitchens, with all their convenience and precision, is perhaps some of that intimate connection with the cooking process. We don't need to judge fire temperature by feel anymore. We don't need to test doneness by pressing meat with our fingers. We don't need to know how to maintain a simmer without a burner dial. But in losing those necessities, have we also lost some of the deep understanding that came with them? I'm not suggesting we should give up our ovens and thermometers. That would be silly. But there's value in understanding how cooking works at a fundamental level, in developing those instincts and judgments that medieval cooks relied on. When you can tell by smell that bread is nearly done, or feel by touch that meat is perfectly cooked, you're connecting with knowledge that spans centuries, touching the same understanding that kept castle kitchens running long before anyone invented a temperature dial. All these cooking techniques, these careful methods of transforming ingredients into meals, they culminated in a journey from fire to table, from kitchen to great hall. The food had to travel through the castle, arriving hot and beautifully presented, served with the ceremony and precision that reinforced the social order. Understanding that final journey from the moment a dish left the kitchen to the instant it appeared before the Lord reveals the last piece of this elaborate puzzle. The dish is perfect. The roast has achieved that ideal balance of crispy exterior and tender interior. The sauce has been carefully adjusted, tasted and retasted until the flavors sing in harmony. The bread emerged from the oven at precisely the right moment, its crust golden and crackling. Everything the master cook has worked toward for hours, everything his team has coordinated and executed, it's all come together beautifully. But here's the thing, none of it matters if the food arrives at the Great Hall cold, or if it gets dropped on the stairs, or if it's presented sloppily, or if the timing is wrong and the Lord is kept waiting. The journey from kitchen to table was its own kind of choreography, one final performance that could make or break the entire meal. And this journey happened through spaces most castle residents never saw, narrow corridors and steep staircases specifically designed to keep servants invisible. Because that was the key to the whole system. Food appeared on the Lord's table as if by magic, as if it materialized fully formed without any of the sweaty, chaotic labor that actually produced it. The separation between the kitchen's reality and the Great Hall's elegant illusion was maintained through architecture, through careful routing of servants, through an understanding that some people should be seen and others should remain invisible. Let me describe these service passages because they're fascinating in their own right. Imagine a narrow stone staircase, maybe only 3 feet wide, winding upward from the kitchen level. The steps are worn smooth from centuries of feet carrying trays and platters. The ceiling is low, barely 6 feet high in places, meaning tall servants had to duck. There are no windows, no decoration, nothing but bare stone walls and dim light from oil lamps mounted at intervals. The air smells of smoke and food, those scents following servants up from the kitchen below. These passages weren't afterthoughts. They were carefully planned features of castle architecture, especially in the more sophisticated designs of the 14th century. The goal was efficiency combined with discretion. Servants needed to move quickly between kitchen and hall, but they also needed to remain out of sight from the main living areas. A nobleman walking through his castle shouldn't encounter kitchen boys hauling dirty dishes or scullions carrying buckets of water. The service passages made this separation possible. The stairways were deliberately steep and direct, minimizing the distance food had to travel. Every extra foot of journey was another opportunity for food to cool, for something to spill, for timing to go wrong. Castle architects understood this and designed accordingly. The best layouts had nearly straight paths from kitchen hearth to great hall, using the minimum number of turns and stairs necessary given the castle's structure. But straight and direct didn't mean easy. Climbing narrow stairs while balancing a large platter of roasted meat, or carrying a heavy tureen of soup, or managing multiple vessels at once, this required skill and sure-footedness. Servants who worked these routes daily developed an almost unconscious ability to navigate them. They knew every uneven step, every low ceiling, every tight turn. They could move quickly in near darkness, guided by muscle memory and familiarity. The butler, remember him from our hierarchy discussions, supervised this entire operation. He was responsible for ensuring food moved from kitchen to table smoothly, and that the serving itself happened according to strict protocols. In wealthy households, the butler might have a team of servers working under him, each with specific responsibilities. Some carried food, others arranged it on serving tables in the hall, still others actually presented dishes to diners. The coordination required was impressive, especially during major feasts when dozens of different dishes needed to arrive in specific sequences. Timing was absolutely critical, and this is where the butler's expertise really shone. Medieval noble dining followed elaborate customs about the order of courses. You didn't just dump all the food on the table at once. Different dishes appeared in careful succession, each course having its own character and purpose. A typical elaborate meal might begin with lighter dishes, perhaps fruits or salads to stimulate the appetite. Then would come the main courses, multiple dishes presented simultaneously, roasted meats, stews, fish on fast days, all arranged attractively on the table. Later courses might include more roasts, different preparations, additional variety. The meal would conclude with sweet dishes, fruits preserved in honey or sugar-spiced wines, cheeses. Each course had to appear at the right moment, neither too quickly, which would seem rushed and inelegant, nor too slowly, which would bore or frustrate diners. The butler tracked time, internally communicating with the kitchen about when to send up the next course, coordinating with servers about clearing finished dishes before new ones arrived. He was essentially directing a performance one where the audience, the noble diners, should never see the backstage machinery that made it all work. Temperature control during this journey from kitchen to hall was a genuine challenge. Hot food needed to arrive hot. We take this for granted with our insulated carriers and warming lamps, but medieval servants had no such tools. They relied on speed and coordination. Food was pulled from the fire or oven at the last possible moment, immediately placed on serving vessels and rushed upstairs. The less time between cooking and serving, the better. Some dishes were more forgiving than others. Stews and soups retained heat reasonably well in their heavy cauldrons or ceramic serving bowls. Bread stayed warm for a decent period, especially when wrapped in cloth. But roasted meats cooled quickly, and there wasn't much servants could do about it except work fast. This is one reason why elaborate medieval feasts had multiple courses. If one roast cooled too much, another would arrive soon enough fresh from the fire. The serving vessels themselves were part of the display. Wealthy households served food on silver or pewter platters polished to a shine. The vessels themselves communicated status and wealth. A roasted peacock might be presented on an enormous silver charger, arranged with its own feathers replaced to recreate the bird's magnificent appearance. This wasn't just about food. It was theatre spectacle, an opportunity to impress guests with both culinary skill and material wealth. Arranging food attractively on these platters was yet another specialized skill. The person responsible for this final presentation, sometimes the butler himself, sometimes a dedicated server, needed an eye for visual appeal. Sliced roasts were arranged in overlapping layers to show their perfectly cooked interiors. Sauces were drizzled artfully. Garnishes were placed strategically. Everything was composed to look as good as possible when it appeared on the table. And here's where we need to talk about the Great Hall itself, because understanding the serving process requires understanding the space where it happened. The Great Hall was the public face of the castle, the room where the lord demonstrated his power and hospitality. It was usually the largest room in the castle, often with high ceilings, elaborate decoration, and enough space to accommodate the entire household plus guests. Tables in the Great Hall were arranged hierarchically. The Lord's table, called the High Table, sat on a raised platform called the dais at one end of the hall. This elevation meant the Lord literally looked down on everyone else, a physical manifestation of social hierarchy. The Lord and his immediate family sat at this high table along with the most honoured guests. The seating arrangement at the high table itself was carefully planned, with the most important people closest to the Lord. Below the dais, additional tables stretched down the length of the hall. These were for household knights, administrators, higher status servants, and less important guests. And somewhere along these lower tables was placed that elaborate salt cellar we discussed before, the one that marked the division between people sitting above the salt and those below it. Servants approached tables from specific sides, usually the side away from the wall, so they could serve without reaching across diners. This was codified in table manners, guides of the period. Diners sat on one side of each table, leaving the other side clear for service. This arrangement seems strange to modern sensibilities. We're used to people sitting around all sides of a table, but it made practical sense for efficient serving in a large hall. The actual moment when food was presented followed strict protocols. Servers didn't just plop dishes down carelessly. They approached with dignity, announced what was being served at least for the high table, and placed dishes where the butler or lord indicated. For the most important diners, there might even be a tasting ceremony, where someone tasted the food before the lord to check for poison, though by the 14th century this was more symbolic ritual than genuine security measure. Diners shared dishes, a practice that seems odd to our individualistic modern culture, but was standard in medieval times. A large platter of roasted meat might be placed between 2 or 3 people, who would all eat from it, carving off pieces as desired. This sharing extended to drinking vessels as well. It wasn't unusual for 2 diners to share a single cup, taking turns drinking from it. Trenchers, those large plates or thick slices of bread that served as plates, were also typically shared between 2 people. This communal dining created social bonds but also required elaborate manners to navigate successfully. Numerous guides existed instructing people on proper behavior when sharing food. Don't grab the best pieces for yourself. Don't take too much at once. Don't reach across your companion. Don't drink before your companion if they're of higher status. Don't put food back on the shared plate after you've bitten it. The list went on and on, a complex code of conduct governing every aspect of shared eating. And through all of this, servers moved constantly, bringing new dishes, removing finished ones, refilling cups, managing the continuous flow of food and drink that a proper feast required. They had to be attentive without being intrusive, present when needed but invisible when not. A good server could read the room, knowing when someone needed their cup refilled, or when a particular dish should be removed, all without being explicitly told. The noise in the Great Hall during a major feast must have been remarkable. Dozens or hundreds of people talking, eating, laughing. Musicians playing from a gallery often positioned above the screen's passage at the opposite end from the high table. Dogs begging for scraps under the tables. Servants moving about with dishes and vessels. All of this happening in a large stone room that would have amplified and echoed every sound. It was festive, certainly, but probably also chaotic and overwhelming by modern standards. After the meal ended, the clearing process began, and this was its own logistical challenge. Everything that had been carried up had to be carried back down. Dirty plates, empty, serving platters, half-finished dishes, leftover bread bones, scraps. The servants who'd brought food up now reversed the process, hauling everything back to the kitchen for cleaning. This downward journey was actually trickier than the upward one because dirty dishes were often greasy, making them harder to grip securely on those narrow stairs. Back in the kitchen, the scullions we met at the very beginning faced hours of washing. Every pot, every pan, every serving vessel, every utensil had to be cleaned and put away. The dirty water had to be heated, the dishes scrubbed with sand or lye rinsed, dried and stored properly. This could take as long as the cooking itself, maybe longer for a particularly large feast. And here's something I find touching this entire elaborate system, from cooking to serving to cleaning it, repeated day after day, meal after meal, year after year. The same routes through the castle, the same protocols for serving, the same hierarchy determining who ate what where. There was comfort in this repetition, a rhythm that gave structure to life. Everyone knew their role, knew what was expected, knew how things should be done. But there was also room for individual excellence within the system. A particularly skilled server might earn recognition and advancement. A butler who managed feasts flawlessly might gain the Lord's favour. Even scullions, if they were observant and hard-working, might learn enough to move up eventually. The system was rigid but not entirely inflexible. What strikes me most about this journey from kitchen to hall is how it embodied medieval society's fundamental contradictions. On one hand, elaborate measures to maintain invisibility, to pretend that food simply appeared without labour. On the other hand, genuine appreciation for the skill required to make that illusion work. The Lord might never visit the kitchen or acknowledge the scullions who washed his dishes, but he absolutely noticed when the food arrived cold or the service was sloppy. The labour was invisible, but the results were scrutinised intensely. And the architecture itself, those narrow passages and hidden stairs, they're still there in many surviving castles. You can walk them today feeling the worn stone under your feet, ducking under the same low ceilings that servants ducked under 600 years ago. There's something profound about that physical connection to the past, about literally walking in the footsteps of people whose names we'll never know, but whose labour made medieval castle life possible. These passages and the service they facilitated were the final link in a chain that connected fields and farms to the great hall, that transformed raw ingredients into elaborate feasts that turned the labour of dozens of invisible workers into the visible splendour of noble dining. They were the last act in a performance that began before dawn in the dark kitchen and ended with satisfied nobles pushing back from the table. But this entire system, this elaborate machinery of kitchen and service, it existed within a particular moment in history. The 14th century castle kitchen represents a peak of medieval culinary sophistication, a refinement of practices developed over centuries. And like all historical moments, it eventually gave way to something new, something different. The legacy of these kitchens, the innovations they pioneered, and the traditions they established, that legacy extends far beyond the Middle Ages, reaching all the way into our modern world in ways that might surprise you. Let's explore what happened to these medieval kitchen practices and what they left behind. Everything ends. That's the nature of history, isn't it? Empires fall. Technologies become obsolete. Ways of life that seemed permanent dissolve into memory. The medieval castle kitchen, with its roaring fires and hidden passages, its strict hierarchies and specialized tools, eventually gave way to something different. New cooking methods emerged. Social structures changed. The elaborate system we've been exploring disappeared, transformed by time and innovation into forms we'd barely recognize. But here's what fascinates me. Nothing really disappears completely. History doesn't work that way. Old practices leave traces influencing what comes after, in ways both obvious and subtle. And when you look closely at modern professional kitchens, when you examine how restaurants and catering operations function today, you can still see the medieval castle kitchen living on its principles and innovations woven into the fabric of contemporary culinary culture. The connection isn't always obvious, but it's there waiting to be discovered. Let's start with the most direct legacy, the brigade system. If you've ever worked in a professional kitchen or watched cooking shows, you've encountered this. The head chef, the sous chefs, the line cooks, each station with its designated responsibilities. Sauce station, grill station, pastry station. A clear hierarchy where everyone knows their role, where orders flow down from the top, and execution happens with precision and coordination. Sound familiar? It should, because this is the medieval kitchen hierarchy updated for the modern world. The system was formalized in the 19th century by Auguste Escoffier, the legendary French chef who revolutionized professional cooking. But Escoffier didn't invent the concept from nothing. He was codifying practices that had existed for centuries, systematizing knowledge that traced back through French court kitchens, through aristocratic households, all the way to those medieval castle kitchens, where master cooks commanded teams of specialized workers. The job titles changed, the tools modernized. The but the fundamental structure, one person in command coordinating multiple specialists working toward a common goal that's medieval through and through. Think about it. The saucier we discussed, the specialist responsible for preparing complex sauces in medieval kitchens, that position still exists in classical French kitchens. The title is the same. The responsibilities have evolved. Obviously, modern sauces use different techniques and ingredients, but the concept of having a dedicated expert whose sole focus is creating the sauces that elevate dishes, that's a direct inheritance from medieval practice. The same is true for many other positions. The pâtissier, the pastry chef, descends from medieval bakers who specialized in fine breads and sweet preparations. The poissonnier responsible for fish dishes has roots in the specialized fish cooks. Medieval kitchens employed especially important, given all those fast days when meat was forbidden. Even the plonger, the dishwasher, is the modern equivalent of the scullion, still at the bottom of the hierarchy, still doing the essential but unglamorous work that makes everything else possible. And the coordination, the timing, the way a modern kitchen operates during service, that's medieval too. When a chef calls out orders and coordinates multiple dishes to arrive at the table simultaneously, when different stations work in parallel on components of the same meal, when the entire operation moves with practice choreography, you're watching a performance whose origins lie in those castle kitchens, preparing feasts for demanding nobles. The technology changed, the scale often increased, but the core challenge, getting complex food to people at the right time and temperature, while maintaining quality that hasn't changed in 700 years. Let's talk about specialization, because this is another profound legacy. The medieval kitchen's approach, having dedicated experts for specific tasks rather than generalists doing everything, became the foundation for how professional cooking evolved. Before the medieval period, cooking in most contexts was more generalized. Someone who cooked did all aspects of cooking. But as castle kitchens grew and noble demands became more sophisticated, specialization made sense. You couldn't be expert in everything, so you became expert in one thing. This principle extended far beyond cooking. It's actually one of the key developments that enabled the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The idea that deep expertise in a narrow area produces better results than shallow knowledge across many areas, that you can organize complex operations by breaking them into specialized components. This became fundamental to how Western civilization organized work. And while the medieval kitchen certainly didn't invent specialization, it was one of the places where the concept was refined and proven effective. Modern professional training reflects this too. Culinary schools don't just teach cooking, they teach specific skills and stations. Students rotate through sauces, then meats, then pastry, building expertise in each area before synthesizing them. This educational approach, learning through specialized rotations under expert supervision, mirrors how medieval apprentices learned their craft. The scullion, watching the master cook, gradually being given more responsibility, eventually specializing in a particular area. That's the ancestor of modern culinary education. Now let's consider physical kitchen design, because the medieval innovations we discussed had remarkably lasting influence. The separation of cooking areas from dining areas, which seems obvious now, was actually a medieval development. Earlier kitchens were often in the same space as dining, with all the smoke and heat and smells that involved. The medieval realization that you could have better results by cooking in one place and serving in another using hidden passages to connect them became standard practice in large-scale food service. Victorian-era grand houses adopted this model directly. The kitchen was downstairs or in a separate wing, connected to the dining room by service corridors designed to keep servants invisible. Hotels and restaurants followed the same principle. Even modern restaurant design maintains this separation. Though the barrier between kitchen and dining room has become more permeable, sometimes even transparent, as kitchens became theatre rather than secrets to be hidden. The drainage systems, the ventilation designs, the careful attention to fire safety and heat management. These medieval innovations establish principles that still guide kitchen architecture. Modern commercial kitchens have elaborate ventilation systems pulling smoke and heat away floor drains for easy cleaning, fire suppression equipment, all of this descending from solutions medieval builders developed. The materials changed, the technology improved, but the problems and the basic approaches to solving them remained consistent. Storage principles carried forward too. The separation of dry goods, refrigerated items, and frozen items in modern kitchens echoes the medieval separation of pantry, larder, and cellar. The practice of organizing storage by category and rotation, using older stock first to minimize waste, that's medieval warehouse management, adapted for contemporary use. Even the modern walk-in refrigerator serves the same function as those cool underground cellars, preserving ingredients until they're needed. And here's something I find particularly interesting: the preservation techniques. Yes, we have refrigeration and freezing now, technologies that revolutionized food safety and availability. But traditional preservation methods, salting, smoking, fermenting, drying, these haven't disappeared. In fact, they've experienced a renaissance. Artisanal bacon, craft smoked fish, fermented vegetables, aged cheeses. These are premium products commanding high prices precisely because they use old techniques that create flavors refrigeration can't replicate. The farm-to-table movement, which emphasizes local sourcing and seasonal eating, is actually a return to medieval practice. Castle kitchens sourced locally by necessity. They ate seasonally because that's what was available. Modern chefs who prize fresh local ingredients, who design menus around what's in season, who build relationships with specific farmers and producers, they're recreating patterns that were simply how things worked in medieval times. Even the concept of the kitchen garden, now fashionable again in high-end restaurants, where chefs grow their own herbs and vegetables, that's medieval. Those castle gardens that supplied fresh ingredients directly to the kitchen, eliminating supply chain complications and ensuring quality, that model is being rediscovered as superior to industrial agriculture for certain applications. The revival of traditional cooking methods has brought renewed attention to techniques medieval cooks would recognize. Cooking over wood fires, which creates flavors gas and electric heat can't match. Roasting on spits, increasingly popular in restaurants serving whole animals. Baking in wood-fired ovens, which produces breads with textures and crusts modern ovens struggle to achieve. These aren't nostalgic affectations. They're recognitions that old methods sometimes produce results modern technology can't improve upon. There's even something we might call a medieval aesthetic returning to high-end dining. The emphasis on fire and smoke, on visible cooking processes, on the drama of whole animals being butchered and cooked on rustic presentations that celebrate the raw materials rather than hiding them under elaborate sauces. All of this would feel somewhat familiar to a medieval cook. Obviously, the execution differs enormously, but the underlying values, respect for ingredients, mastery of fire, the meal as performance, these span the centuries. But perhaps the most profound legacy is something less tangible. The recognition that feeding people well is skilled work deserving of respect. For much of history, after the medieval period, cooking was considered lowly labour, something servants did not, a prestigious profession. The Victorian era particularly looked down on manual trades, including cooking. But the medieval attitude where a master cook could hold significant status, where culinary skill was valued expertise that eventually reasserted itself. The modern celebrity chef commanding respect and high incomes being recognized as an artist and craftsperson that's actually closer to the medieval model than to the intervening centuries. The master cook who could negotiate between noble households, whose reputation preceded him, who commanded authority over his domain, that's the ancestor of today's renowned chefs, who run culinary empires and appear on television. The understanding that great cooking requires years of training, that it combines technical skill with creativity, that it's both art and craft. This medieval insight was lost for a while but has been thoroughly reclaimed. Culinary schools now confer degrees. Cooking is studied seriously as a discipline. Chefs write books, teach classes, are interviewed about their philosophy and approach. This elevation of cooking to a respected profession, this is medieval values finally winning out after centuries of being undervalued. And there's something else, something harder to quantify, but equally important: the tradition itself, the sense of continuity, the knowledge that cooking techniques and kitchen wisdom are passed down through generations. When a chef teaches an apprentice how to tell when bread is done by sound, when they demonstrate the feel of properly kneaded dough, when they share the intuitive knowledge that can't be captured in recipes, they're participating in a transmission of expertise that goes back centuries. This is what I mean by nothing really disappearing. The specific castle kitchens are gone reduced to ruins or converted to other uses. The social systems that supported them dissolved. The people who worked in them are dust. But the knowledge, the techniques, the organizational principles, the respect for craft, these survived. They evolved, certainly. They adapted to new technologies and social conditions. But the through line is there if you look for it. Visit a castle with a preserved or reconstructed medieval kitchen today. Stand in those enormous fireplaces, walk the service stairs, look at the storage cellars, and then visit a high-end restaurant kitchen. Watch the controlled chaos of dinner service. See the head chef coordinating multiple stations. Notice how food moves from cooking area to dining room through passages designed for efficiency. The connections become visible, separated by centuries but united by fundamental principles about how to cook for many people, how to organize complex work, how to transform raw ingredients into memorable meals. There's something deeply moving about this continuity, I think. In a world that often seems to be changing so fast that nothing stable remains, these connections to the past provide a kind of anchor. They remind us that human problems like how to feed people well don't actually change that much. The solutions evolve, but the core challenges persist, and knowledge accumulated over centuries, refined through countless iterations tested by time, that knowledge has value that transcends any particular era. The medieval castle kitchen represents a particular moment when many culinary innovations came together. Specialized roles, architectural solutions to practical problems, sophisticated preservation techniques, the beginning of professional culinary culture. It wasn't the beginning of cooking, obviously, and it wasn't the end of culinary evolution. But it was a crucial development point, a time when practices were formalized and systematized in ways that proved durable enough to influence everything that came after. And that's the real legacy, not specific recipes or tools, though some of those survived, but the mindset, the understanding that feeding people is important work requiring skill and organization, the recognition that quality matters, that taking care with ingredients and technique produces better results, the knowledge that fire and time and human expertise can transform basic materials into something remarkable. These insights learned and refined in those smoky stone chambers, carried forward into our world, shaping how we think about food and cooking even now. So as we step back from our journey through these medieval kitchens, as we leave behind the roaring fires and the hidden passages, the hierarchy of workers and the specialized tools, take a moment to appreciate the legacy. Next time you visit a restaurant, look for the medieval kitchen still living in its organisation. When you watch a cooking show, recognise the heritage in its structure. If you make bacon or smoke fish or ferment vegetables, know you're practicing ancient arts that kept castles fed through winter. The medieval castle kitchen is gone, but its influence echoes through time, shaping our present in ways both obvious and subtle. And understanding that connection, seeing how past and present interweave, that enriches our appreciation of both. History isn't just what happened before, it's the foundation we stand on, the context that makes sense of where we are. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it's also a reminder that good ideas, truly effective solutions to human problems, can last a very long time indeed. As we conclude this journey through the heart of the medieval castle, through its stone walls and flickering fires, through the lives of the people who worked there and the systems they created, I hope you found something valuable. Maybe it's historical knowledge, understanding a period and place you didn't know before. Maybe it's appreciation for how complex and sophisticated medieval life could be, shattering simplistic assumptions about the past. Maybe it's recognition of connections between then and now, seeing how our present was shaped by distant choices and innovations. Or maybe it's a renewed appreciation for cooking itself, for the long human tradition of transforming ingredients through skill and care, of gathering to share meals, of the daily work that keeps us all fed. Whatever you take from this exploration, thank you for coming along. The kitchen fires have burned down now, but their warmth remains. There's a castle I visited a few years ago in the south of France, Castelnau-la-Chapelle, in the Dordogne region. It's a magnificent fortress perched on a hilltop commanding views of the valley below. Tourists come for the medieval weaponry displays, for the stunning architecture, for the reconstructed siege engines in the courtyard. But I found myself drawn to a different part of the castle entirely, down a narrow staircase through a heavy wooden door into the reconstructed kitchen, and standing there in the 800-year-old space with its massive fireplace and stone walls, something shifted in my perspective. This wasn't just a museum exhibit, it was a workplace. Real people had stood exactly where I was standing, doing work that mattered, solving problems, taking pride in their skills, living their lives. The stone beneath my feet had been worn smooth by countless footsteps. The walls had absorbed centuries of heat and smoke. The very air seemed to hold memories. I thought about Thomas, our scullion, from the beginning of this journey, waking before dawn to light the fires. About the master cook tasting sauces with that concentrated focus of someone whose reputation depended on getting it exactly right. About the spit boys with their aching arms, the bakers judging oven temperature by instinct, the servants climbing those narrow stairs, carrying precious dishes, trying not to stumble, trying not to fail. All of them gone now, their names unrecorded, their faces unknown. But their work, their knowledge, their daily efforts, those rippled forward through time to reach us. And that's really what this entire exploration has been about, hasn't it? Not just the physical space of castle kitchens or the technical details of medieval cooking, though we've certainly delved deep into both. It's been about recognizing the humanity in history, understanding that the past was lived by real people, facing real challenges, developing real solutions that deserve our respect and attention. The medieval castle kitchen represents something fundamental about human nature, our need to eat obviously, but also our drive to do things well, to organize ourselves efficiently, to pass knowledge to the next generation, to take pride in skilled work even when it's difficult and unappreciated. These aren't medieval values or modern values. They're human values expressed differently in different times, but fundamentally consistent. When we look at those enormous fireplaces, we're seeing problem solving. How do you cook for 50 people with only fire and iron? You build a fireplace big enough to hold multiple cooking stations. You develop tools that work with extreme heat. You organize workers so everyone knows their role. Simple solutions perhaps, but arrived at through experience and refinement, through trial and error, through the accumulated wisdom of generations. When we consider the hierarchy of kitchen workers, we're seeing social organization. How do you coordinate complex work involving many people? You establish clear lines of authority. You specialize, letting people develop expertise. You create pathways for advancement that motivate workers to improve. These organizational principles weren't unique to kitchens, obviously, but kitchens were places where they were refined and proven effective. When we examine the preservation techniques, the careful storage systems, the elaborate serving protocols, we're seeing planning and foresight. Medieval people understood they couldn't just live in the moment. They had to think ahead, prepare for seasons when food was scarce, maintain standards even when circumstances were difficult. This capacity for delayed gratification, for working today to ensure tomorrow, that's very human and very admirable. And when we trace the legacy forward, seeing how medieval innovations influenced professional cooking right up to our present day, we're recognizing that good ideas persist. Not because anyone consciously preserved them as historical artifacts, but because they worked. Because organizing kitchens with specialized stations proved more efficient than having everyone do everything. Because maintaining quality standards produced better results than accepting whatever happened. Because respecting skilled work attracted talented people who push the craft forward. I think there's something hopeful in this. We live in an era of rapid change where technologies and social structures that seemed permanent can dissolve in years or even months. It's easy to feel unmoored, to worry that nothing stable remains. But understanding history, really understanding it deeply, reveals patterns of continuity alongside the change. Human problems persist. Good solutions endure. Knowledge accumulates and gets passed forward even when the specific context changes dramatically. The medieval cook lighting his fires at dawn, worrying about whether the roast would be ready on time, hoping his sauce would please the Lord, that person was fundamentally like us. Different circumstances, different technologies, different social structures, yes. But the same human concerns about doing work well, about providing for others, about earning respect through skill and effort, recognizing that similarity across centuries doesn't diminish the differences, it enriches our understanding of both past and present, and it reminds us that we're part of something larger than our individual lives, or even our specific era. Every time you cook a meal, you're participating in a tradition that goes back not just to the Middle Ages, but far beyond, to the first humans who discovered that fire transformed food, making it safer and more delicious. Every organizational system you encounter, every hierarchy at work or school, draws on principles refined over centuries of human collaboration. Every time knowledge is passed from expert to novice, whether in a classroom or a kitchen or a workshop, you're witnessing the transmission mechanism that has preserved and built human capability across generations. The medieval castle kitchen is just one node in this vast network of human knowledge and practice. It's not more important than what came before or what came after, but it's a particularly interesting node, a time when various innovations came together in ways that proved influential, a place where we can see clearly how practical problems drove human ingenuity, how social systems organized complex work, how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Walking through the reconstructed kitchen at Castelnau, I found myself unexpectedly emotional. Not because of nostalgia for a time I never knew, or romanticism about the Middle Ages, which, as we've discussed, had plenty of harsh realities, but because of connection. Standing in that space where people had worked and struggled and succeeded and failed, I felt linked to them across the centuries. Their efforts had made my present possible in small but real ways, and my understanding of their world, my appreciation for what they accomplished that kept their memory alive in some sense, honoured the humanity they shared with me. That's what good history does, I think. It's not just a collection of facts and dates to memorise. It's a way of expanding your sense of human possibility, of seeing how people in very different circumstances grappled with challenges both similar to and different from your own. It's a reminder that humans are creative and resilient, that we solve problems and build systems and pass knowledge forward, that the work we do matters even if our individual names get lost. As you go about your life after this journey through medieval kitchens, I hope you'll carry some of that perspective with you. When you cook, maybe you'll think about the long tradition you're part of, the accumulated knowledge that makes what you do possible. When you encounter organizational systems at work, maybe you'll recognize principles refined over centuries. When you visit historical sites, maybe you'll look beyond the obvious attractions to the everyday spaces, the kitchens and workshops, the places where regular people did their work, and maybe you'll develop a deeper appreciation for the continuity that underlies change, for the human constants that persist, despite dramatically different surface conditions. The medieval castle kitchen is gone, but what it represents, human ingenuity applied to practical problems, knowledge preserved and passed forward, pride in skilled work, community effort toward common goals that's very much alive. I want to thank you for staying with me through this exploration. 2.5 hours is a long time to spend learning about anything, let alone medieval kitchens. The fact that you're still here, still listening, means something. Maybe you were just curious about history. Maybe you love cooking and wanted to understand its roots. Maybe you stumbled onto this by accident and got drawn in. Whatever brought you here, I'm grateful you came along for the journey. If you enjoyed this, if you found value in this deep dive into a specific historical topic, I hope you'll let me know. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you most, or what you'll remember, or how this changed your thinking about the past or about cooking. Subscribe if you want more historical explorations like this one. And share this with someone who you think might appreciate it, because these stories deserve to be told and retold. These connections between past and present deserve to be recognized. History isn't just dusty textbooks and distant dates. It's the foundation we stand on, the context that makes sense of our present, the reminder that we're part of something larger than ourselves. The medieval castle kitchen, with its roaring fires and specialized workers, its careful preservation, and elaborate serving, its innovations and traditions, that's one small piece of the vast human story. But it's a piece worth understanding, worth appreciating, worth preserving in memory. So thank you for exploring it with me. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for caring about the past and how it shaped the present. The fires in those medieval kitchens have long since burned out. The workers are gone. The castle walls stand silent. But the warmth of human effort and ingenuity, the light of knowledge passed forward through generations, that continues to burn, illuminating our path forward. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Keep learning, keep questioning, keep appreciating the long human story we're all part of. And maybe the next time you light your stove or step into your kitchen, spare a thought for those medieval cooks who stood before their massive fireplaces, facing the same fundamental challenge you face, turning raw ingredients into something nourishing and good. You're more connected to them than you might think. I'll be back soon with another story from history, another deep dive into a specific time and place, another exploration of how the past echoes into our present. There's so much more to discover, so many fascinating corners of human experience to illuminate. I can't wait to share the next journey with you. Until then, stay curious, my friends.